After the critical success that was The Legend of Zelda, Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka set out to make a sequel that would be completely different from the original Legend of Zelda. While typically, most games that see success iterate on what made it successful, that wasn't necessarily the case on the NES, with several games heavily experimenting for their sequels, and Zelda 2 would be no different. That's also led this game to be very divisive, and for our purposes, incredibly interesting to look at. For my part, I've always enjoyed Zelda 2 for the departure that it is, although not as much as the original game. Either way, what I want to do is break down the mechanics that would make up Zelda 2 and talk deeply about its design choices and their consequences. For those of you just joining me, this is the second video in my Zelda series. Typically, if mechanics repeat, I don't discuss them again unless there was a change, but Zelda 2 is so different, there'll probably be very little overlap here. So, let's go over my excuse to finally add Zelda 2 to my CIB collection of Zelda games. Before diving into the game design, I always like to take a look at the development history that would go into actually creating these games, as those can sometimes help inform why certain design choices were made. In the case of Zelda 2, the most telling quote comes from Shigeru Miyamoto in an interview with Superplay magazine. Superplay asks him, "The sequel Zelda 2 Adventures of Link was a very different game. Why was this? And why have you never done anything like it again?" Shigeru Miyamoto responds, "It was my idea, but the actual game was developed by another team, different people to those that made the first game. Compared to Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2 went exactly what we expected. All games I make usually get better in the development process, since good ideas keep coming, but Zelda 2 was sort of a failure." He clarifies this point in a Kotaku interview with Stephen Totilo. "When we're designing games, we have our plan for what we're going to design, but in our process, it evolves and grows from there. In Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, unfortunately, all we ended up creating was what we had originally planned on paper." Let's put aside Shigeru Miyamoto's disappointment in Zelda 2 for a moment and talk about that new team. On it, there were actually two new directors to Zelda 2, Tadashi Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura, with Shigeru Miyamoto serving as a producer. And as it turns out, Tadashi Sugiyama was interviewed for Nintendo's Japanese website, with a translation of that interview posted by Zelda Dungeon. According to Sugiyama-san, development started with Mr. Miyamoto saying he wanted to make a side-scrolling action game that made use of up and down movements for attacks and defense, types of moves that weren't possible in the first game. Rather than being a continuation of the series, it started as a new sword and shield type of action game. We were experimenting while producing the game, so we didn't really have the first game's systems in mind while developing it. As for it being unique within the series, we were searching for new ways to play, so you could say it's like a spin-off. As far as inspirations that would lead into Zelda 2 go, there's no direct quotes. And that could be why I honestly missed the very likely the Tower of Jiraga influence on Zelda 1. There's no direct quotes that the Tower of Jiraga influenced Zelda 1 that I could find, but notably, Shigeru Miyamoto was a fan and even interviewed Masanobu Endo, the creator of both Xevious and the Tower of Jiraga. Shigeru Miyamoto says, "Well, I'm a big fan of Xevious and Tower of Jiraga myself. We had them bring an arcade cabinet to our office, and I played Tower of Jiraga on it." So thank you to KBKKSH91, PanZ, and Clunky Man for bringing this up in my Zelda 1 video. How much Zelda 1 was influenced by the Tower of Jiraga? It's impossible to say. And similarly, Zelda 2 seems to have some very likely influences. For example, Shigeru Miyamoto worked on the NES port of Kung Fu Master. Does that mean there were influences from Kung Fu? Not necessarily, as there were other action games at the time, but you never know. Additionally, the overworld of Zelda 2 seems very reminiscent to the overworld of the 1986 game Dragon Quest, although Shigeru Miyamoto noted that Ultima 1 was an influence on Zelda 1, so it's possible that same overworld idea from Ultima 1 was the very same influence for Zelda 2, and not necessarily Dragon Quest. But there are so many similarities and even references, it seems pretty likely there was at least some Dragon Quest influence. Both overworlds feature random battles, Zelda 2 has RPG leveling mechanics, and Zelda 2 now features actual towns and NPCs. But RPGs and leveling mechanics already existed in games like Ultima, and the team could have simply wanted actual towns this time around without any outside influence. The most direct link to Dragon Quest, though, comes from an Easter egg in Saria Town, where the Japanese version of Zelda 2 includes a grave that says, Yusha Roto Koko ni Nemuru, which translates to, Here lies Roto the hero. Roto is the Japanese name for the legendary hero from Dragon Quest, whom the protagonist is the descendant of. So that does speak to Zelda 2 likely having influences from Dragon Quest, intended or not. I saw a video by NES Complex that claims Dragon Buster on the arcade/Famicom was a clear inspiration for Zelda 2. The game released in 1985, and according to a random excerpt from the British gaming magazine Computer Plus Video Games, was, quote, apparently a great hit in Japan. On the surface level, that might be true, this was an inspiration, there's a map and 2D side-scrolling action, but who knows how much inspiration, if any, the team actually took. Coming back to Shigeru Miyamoto and his disappointment for Zelda 2, in that aforementioned Kotaku interview, he mentioned some of his disappointment stems from things the team wanted to do for Zelda 2, but couldn't due to technological limitations. He says, so one thing, of course, is from a hardware perspective, if we'd been able to have the switch between the scenes speed up, if that had been faster, we could have done more with how we use the side-scrolling versus the overhead and kind of the interchange between the two, but because of the limitations on how quickly those scenes changed, we weren't able to. On that note, there actually is a loading time required on the Famicom Disk System version of Zelda 2 between scenes, sometimes more noticeable than others. Shigeru Miyamoto goes on to state, the other thing is it would have been nice to have had bigger enemies in the game, but the Famicom/NES hardware wasn't capable of doing that. Certainly, with hardware nowadays you can do that, and we have done that, but of course nowadays, creating bigger enemies takes a lot of effort. That's really all I could find on the development of Zelda 2. There's not too much about it, perhaps due to its overall lack of popularity compared to other Zelda games, or perhaps because Shigeru Miyamoto and team prefer talking about other games they've created. It's hard to say. In a question posed to Tadashi Sugiyama, he's asked, there are fans out there whose favorite game in the series is Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Do you have a message for these unique fans? Sugiyama-san responds, those kind of people exist? That's a joke, of course, but I'm very grateful when someone says that. As a game creator, that is the best compliment to receive, so thank you all very much. Point being, it's not exactly a mystery to the team who created Zelda 2 that it was divisive and doesn't hold the same legacy as many games from the rest of the series. Like Zelda 1, Zelda 2 was also originally developed for the Famicom Disk System and wouldn't release to the NES outside of Japan until over a year after its original release. Turn on Zelda 2, and players will be greeted by a title screen reminiscent of Zelda 1. Whereas Zelda 1 saw a waterfall off the edge of a cliff with the title card showcasing a sword and the Triforce, Zelda 2's title screen also features a cliff, this time with a sword stuck in it, and a forest and ocean off in the distance, this time with the twinkling stars of a nighttime sky above. Overall, I think this achieves a similar effect to the Zelda 1 title, showcasing the idea of adventure, with a sword in the stone in the foreground dropped against a scenic vista, enticing players to grab the sword and whisk away onto an adventure. In fact, with this twinkling stars and more simple title, I actually prefer this title sequence to Zelda 1's, as the vista really pops in the nighttime sky. This time around, the music wasn't composed by Koji Kondo, but instead Akito Nakatsuka, whose twinkling melody to start us off fits perfectly in with the nighttime sky. Notably absent from the Zelda 2 title is the Triforce, and while the Triforce is still important to Zelda 2, it doesn't hold the same significance as in Zelda 1, where every dungeon saw Link collecting a Triforce shard, so perhaps this is one reason for it being de-emphasized. That, and it simply might have not looked as clean. Another notable change to Zelda 2's title is the story crawl happens right here on the title card, rather than a separate scene that loads to showcase the title, as in Zelda 1. Something I find to be pretty interesting is that the story in both games is presented in English rather than in Japanese, with Japanese players meant to read the manual if they want the full story. Speaking on the manual for a second, that was a frequent note I got in my first video, and I do want to address manuals for NES games, including both Zelda 1 and 2, as I found direct quotes from Shigeru Miyamoto regarding this, but I'll come to that later. As far as the story is concerned, from the game itself, we get that even though Link defeated Ganon, a sleeping spell was cast on Princess Zelda. The only way to awaken her is with a third Triforce sealed in the palace, and the only way to access that palace and break its seal is to place 6 crystals in 6 other palaces. There's not too much to the story, it's really just a setup for why Link needs to travel to various dungeons. If you lose though, it will trigger the return of Ganon, and there's no specific reason stated in the game as to why. So we turn to the manual. As it turns out, for some reason, the way to revive Ganon is through Link's blood, and by sacrificing him and sprinkling his blood over the ashes of Ganon. Not only that, but the story in the manual changes, at least what my interpretation of Zelda 2 was when I was playing the game as a kid. For starters, those bosses you fight in each temple aren't technically bad or evil, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Apparently, all of the events of The Legend of Zelda 1 took place before Link turned 16, and when he does turn 16, a Triforce appears on his hand. So he goes to ask Impa about this, who's Zelda's nursemaid, and she tells him of the Legend of Zelda. In the past, there was a different, original princess named Zelda. She was told secret information by her dying father, the king, about the Triforce. An evil magician, working alongside the prince, cast a sleeping spell on her. The prince was distraught, and therefore decided every princess in the kingdom from then on should be named Zelda after this original Zelda. So, the Zelda you see in the background of the very start of Zelda 2 isn't Princess Zelda from Zelda 1, but rather the first generation Princess Zelda, which is a direct quote from the Japanese manual, by the way. I'm using ZeldaLegends.net as an additional translation tool here on top of the English manual. From there, Impa gave Link 6 crystals and an archaic scroll no one can read, saying, "For generations, my family has been handed down these things which have been set aside for a time when a great king will come." Somehow, Link is able to read the scroll, which tells him there's a third Triforce of courage. Because if you recall, Zelda 1 only has 2 Triforces in the game, which turn out to be the Triforces of power and wisdom. Because the Triforce of courage can be used for great evil, the ancient king hid it in a great temple at the Valley of Death. And the only way to access that great temple is by defeating the guardian deities in the other 6 temples of Hyrule and placing a crystal inside the statues. So, with the Triforce of courage, Link can break the sleeping spell on the original Princess Zelda and presumably become king. And this will also bring true peace to Hyrule. All of that is to say, the Princess Zelda you're saving in Zelda 2 is a different Princess Zelda from Zelda 1, Ganon's remaining forces are trying to defeat you to use your blood to revive him, and the guardian deities you're defeating in the temples were all set up by the former King of Hyrule and are not evil. Honestly, the ancient sleeping Princess Zelda plot feels a little convoluted to me, and it feels a little less altruistic when part of your goal is to become king of the land. It's also funny when you consider that Zelda you saved in Zelda 1's nursemaid is telling you to go hook up with Zelda's ancient grandmother, as this is the end of Zelda 2. But that's the setup. As I mentioned, the Japanese title scroll is in English, which could have been to help set the vibe of the games, that these are meant to be Western-influenced medieval fantasies. I like those regional touches, and I'm glad we're starting to see a little more of that in games that are released stateside, as it does add another level of mystique when something isn't in your native tongue. One more notable element to Zelda 2's title screen compared to Zelda 1 is that there's no longer an All of Treasures treasure list scroll within the game. Like Zelda 1, all of the items are still listed in the manual, so it's not like the items players can find are completely hidden away from them as a total surprise. So, why the change? If I had to guess, with Zelda 1, As I mentioned in that video, the team was likely concerned players wouldn't understand the idea of an adventure game and wanted to hint to players even within the game about the various treasures they would be able to find. But with the success of Zelda 1, they might have felt this wasn't as necessary to hint in-game anymore, as players now had a foundation and understanding of what the Zelda series was. So perhaps they still wanted it to be a bit of a surprise for players who weren't reading the manual for guidance. I should note, by the way, not every player who plays Zelda 2, or Zelda 1 for that matter, would necessarily have a game manual, which I'll touch on in just a moment. So it comes across as, in Zelda 1, the team felt the treasure list was necessary info they wanted to ensure every single player saw, but in Zelda 2, it was no longer as important, as these treasures could be fun surprises for some players. For a more in-depth discussion on the pros and cons of an included treasure list though, I'd refer you to my Zelda 1 video. As I've mentioned the manual a few times, it is now time to have the NES and Famicom games manual discussion. In my Zelda 1 video, I said something that rubbed quite a few people the wrong way. But that's outside of the game, and I don't personally think it's fair to evaluate the game's design based on what hints an external instruction manual gives, or strategy guide, or anything else external. I had several responses strongly disagreeing with that, such as this one from Nitro0999, saying, "I strongly disagree here. Manuals, included maps and other pack-in material, were very much a part of the intended experience with 80s video games, and would most certainly have been considered as much a part of the design process as the game itself." That's a fair critique, but is that fully accurate? You see, importantly, both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 were created for the Famicom Disk System in Japan, not the NES. And in Japan, the Famicom Disk System had a special in-store kiosk players could use to rewrite their discs with new data that wasn't on the original disc for cheaper than a new game. According to Legends of Localization, Zelda 1 New cost around 2,600 yen at the time, but to download the game onto an existing disc, it was only 500 yen, and for downloading the game, you obviously did not get an instruction manual with it. These disc writer kiosks were introduced in February 1986, at the same time as the Famicom Disk System. So it was very possible a Japanese player who purchased Zelda 1 or Zelda 2 would not have the instruction manual to go along with the game. Now, Zelda 1 does include another interesting bit in its treasure list. At the bottom, it says, "Please look up the manual for details." Shigeru Miyamoto actually talked about this on Nintendo.com in an interview about the Nintendo Classic Mini. He says, "We put in that message because the game included a manual, a sort of booklet. However, some people would use a Famicom disc writer kiosk at game shops to overwrite their games, and we felt they would want some sort of proof that they purchased the game. So we decided to make a booklet with gameplay instructions, story elements to serve as hints, and strategic methods for solving puzzles. We wanted players to read it, so we put in that message saying, 'Please look up the manual for details.' One function of that booklet was to reinforce the feeling of the game's epic setting. Back then, it was mainly package illustrations and arcade game cabinets that conveyed the game's atmosphere, but with the family computer disk system, we used booklets. So they did include certain hints and guide elements they knew players who purchased the game knew would be able to learn, but again, they were also aware not every player would have this. This is relevant to both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, and it goes in line with why they probably chose to include the treasure list in Zelda 1's title crawl, whereas they decided it wasn't necessary in Zelda 2. But in relation to Zelda 1, and in response to some of these comments, there's another important note to touch on. Zelda 1 released to Japan in February 1986, and it wouldn't release outside of Japan until August 1987, a year and a half later. And the thing is, what Americans received with their game was different from what was originally released in Japan. Japan had a manual, but North American players received an additional map and hints that weren't accounted for when originally creating Zelda 1. None of this was included in the original Japanese release a year prior. In the same interview with Shigeru Miyamoto, he says, "Maps were included overseas. The The maps included various hints, but to be honest, I thought it would be more enjoyable to play the game without any help. So we sealed the map with the message reading, "You should only use the map and strategic tips as a last resort." But everyone breaks the seal. So, the major hints that are in Zelda 1's manual, like using the candle to burn down trees, that you can move blocks in dungeons, that you can use a bomb to blow up rocks, or the question mark on the map that indicates where to use the recorder to access a dungeon, none of that was in the original Japanese release of Zelda 1. And even if it had been, players who used the Famicom disc writer wouldn't have those clues, and the team would have known this. And as it turns out, Shigeru Miyamoto didn't actually want players to have the clues that were included in the North American manual because he thought it would make the game less fun. So, the reason I said it wasn't fair to evaluate the game on external resources was because I wasn't sure how much the team who designed Zelda 1 was involved in the creation of the manual and external resources, how much was mandated by the publisher, so Nintendo in this case, and I wasn't sure how much they designed the game intending for players to use those resources. Both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 have in-game hint systems established, so it seems pretty clear that this was the one way the team knew they could convey hints they wanted players to have for both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. As it pertains to Zelda 2, Zelda 2's manual also includes some important hints and information, this time in both the Japanese and English manuals. Things like the total number of spells players can find, or the fact the hammer can be used to break not only rocks, but also trees. But I'll touch on those elements as we get to them. Click into Zelda 2, and like Zelda 1, players will enter into a file select. The system is nearly identical, although this time, players will see an image of Link, which will change with an added Triforce if players have completed the game and are in New Game Plus, the name on the file, the number of deaths the player has accumulated, and then their level stats. Like Zelda 1, I think all of this info is presented in a fantastic and clean way. The only additional info that might have been fun would be to show collected items, but that could also create far too much clutter. So this really does present the most important information, with the level stats specifically. Create your save, and you'll start the game in a temple with the sleeping Princess Zelda, and immediately, a giant departure from the original Legend of Zelda. While Zelda 1 took place entirely from an overhead view, Zelda 2 now has a 2D side-scrolling view for all of its action sequences. So, let's break down how Link's various starting mechanics function and how that makes the action feel. For Link's horizontal movement, similar to Mario, Zelda 2 utilizes a strong acceleration and deceleration factor to give Link his feel. Tap the D-pad left or right, and Link will barely move, but hold down the button, and Link will accelerate, picking up to his full walking speed. Let go of the movement button, and Link won't immediately stop, but will decelerate with a certain stopping speed over time. This also affects turning. When players reverse directions, it seems that a certain acceleration in the opposite direction is applied to Link. That means that players won't stop on a dime if they reverse directions, but will more quickly come to a stop before reversing directions and accelerating in that new direction. All of this makes Link feel much more weighty. Compare this to a game like Mega Man, where players stop and turn on a dime, and players will feel less in control of Link. That said, it's simply a different feel, and both within combat and platforming, it means that players will have to be a little more thoughtful with their decision making, as you can't as easily instinctually react. You're much more committed to your choices. Link's movement speed isn't particularly fast, so it's not like this is ever going to make players feel totally out of control, but it does add that little bit of weight. Additionally, unlike Mario, there's no run button in Zelda 2 that helps speed up Link in both his running and turning, so I think that actually makes you feel that deceleration and Link's weight even more when trying to turn and switch directions, as you can't speed this process up. As far as jumping is concerned, unlike Mario, Link can't jump particularly high, unless players eventually use the jump spell. But even within Link's limited jumping, players actually can control his height, to a limited degree, by holding down the jump button as he jumps. As the range of height players can control with his jump is so small, it once again adds to him feeling much more weighty. many platform games allow players to have a strong degree of control over their jump height. This could be to ensure players have a further degree of control over accurate platforming, their attacking, or dodging enemies. For a game with platforms of various heights, you might want to be able to quickly drop at any moment, but then have a higher jump when necessary. If your attack is related to your jump, like in Mario, where his attack is jumping on top of enemies, the more control you have in your jump, the easier it is to accurately guide Mario to exactly where you need for his attack. Then, there's a game like Mega Man, where your enemies have projectile attacks flying across the screen, so you'll want to jump to avoid them, but also drop at a moment's notice to avoid them. But if your game isn't about platforming, there's not really much reason to emphasize jumping or have this level of control. For newer players, it can be difficult to accurately control a jump completely accurately when you have so much control over it. Many other platform games have one single jump height, because that accurate jumping wasn't necessarily the point of the game or necessary, so you're adding an unnecessary skill hurdle to your game. Zelda 2 has platforming, but it's very limited, so there's not too much reason to have a high degree of control over your jump. You'll also be using your jump for combat, so I think that could be why there's a minor degree of control over its height. Eventually, once Link learns the down attack, where he jumps in the air, thrusts his sword down, and then bounces on enemies, this becomes a little more important, but so long as you can jump over enemies to use your down attack, there's likely not too much more control you need here. Another quirk to the jumping, though, is in how it relates to Link's acceleration. Like Mario, Link jumps higher with more acceleration. On top of that, if players jump when moving forwards and let go of the control pad, Link will continue in the air at the exact same speed players jumped at, with no deceleration. So what that means is that there's a friction value to the ground that the air doesn't have. Run on the ground and let go, and players will slide until they decelerate to a stop. Run and jump in the air, and players will continue at their speed until landing. Because there's no ground friction deceleration in the air, it also seems to make turning in the air harder to do than the ground. If you reverse directions in mid-air, Link will start decelerating and slowly switch directions. But without that ground friction helping with this speed transfer, it's a much slower process, meaning players will barely have stopped and reversed directions by the time they land when trying to turn in mid-air at full speed. Once again, like Link's movement, this adds a much more weighty feel to Link. When you jump and let go, Link is going to travel in his forward direction and can only be slowly turned to a stop, making him feel heavy. He feels like a warrior with a sword and shield, and not some acrobat. And I think this feel, on its own, could potentially turn off some players, because you don't have those snappy feeling controls as a result. But it is what contributes to the game's combat feeling the way it does. If Link could bounce around and swap directions easily, combat encounters would feel much easier to flee or platform around. But instead, you're hero of Link, and therefore you as the player need to truly rely on sword and timing combat, with the platforming being an extra element to consider. Speaking on that combat, a lot of the emphasis is placed on defense and crouching. Link will always have his shield out, and players can crouch to guard his legs. As such, just about every attack will be coming in at Link's body or leg area, so a lot of the game's combat relies on quickly and properly guarding the correct position. Jumping adds a little to this, as there are occasionally attacks that cannot be guarded against with the shield. Turn away from an enemy, and you're exposing your back and no longer defending. Because of the slower acceleration system to Zelda 2, that means you won't be able to make quick escapes this way, and oftentimes, it was probably safer to continue facing the enemy so you have your defensive shield. It means the acceleration system plays into enforcing this sword and shield combat, as it's more difficult to strike, run away, strike again, and run away again when things get dodgy. Granted, enemy knockback helps with this, but we'll talk about the knockback in its own dedicated section. The point is, this shield defense with standing or crouching is a core gameplay element to Zelda 2. Many of the enemy encounters are based around this, with some enemies shooting projectiles Link can deflect with his shield by standing or crouching, and other enemies striking at one of these two positions, with the idea that players should be learning how to quickly read this and deflect the attacks. The other mechanic around this, such as your somewhat limited jumping and slow acceleration, all play into enforcing this style of combat. You are often forced into these close encounters, unlike Zelda 1, where players could oftentimes wander around until they were in a safe attacking position. So, compared to Zelda 1, Zelda 2 definitely pulls off a more action combat-oriented game. Even when players attack with their sword, Link will still hold out his shield and guard in the position Link is attacking from. So if players do a standing attack, Link will still be passively guarding his upper torso, and if players are crouching and attack, Link will still be passively guarding his lower body. Again, this really emphasizes just how defense-oriented combat in Zelda 2 is. So a lot of Zelda 2 is going to come down to, do you enjoy reading enemies and quickly reacting up or down with your shield? If so, this game is going to have a lot to offer. If not, then you're likely going to fall into the camp who thinks Zelda 2 was a major misstep. While combat is heavily focused around defense, Link can also strike enemies with his sword. Like Zelda 1, if Link has full health, a small beam will come out. However, this beam shooting out of Link's sword is greatly nerfed in Zelda 2. While this attack is nice and can help with some enemies, unlike Zelda 1, where Link's sword beam attack was equivalent to a normal sword attack, larger enemies in Zelda 2 cannot be hurt with the sword beam. The sword beam can only injure smaller and weaker enemies, like Octoroks. This still makes it useful as some of these smaller enemies have projectile attacks, so it's nice to have some more range for defeating them. On top of being nerfed in its attack power in terms of just how many enemies can't be hurt with the sword beam, the sword beam now has a far more limited range. Unlike Zelda 1, where the sword beam traveled across the entire screen until it hit a wall or enemy, Zelda 2's sword beam seems to only travel 4 tiles across. So again, it can still be useful, but its uses are far more limited. Because the sword beam was so strong in Zelda 1, it almost made collecting hearts, and therefore more max health, detrimental. Because the further you are from max health, the further you were from being able to use this extremely powerful attack. So by making the sword beam less powerful, it does make not having full health in Zelda 2 not quite as impactful, which is probably a positive thing considering just how often you'll be getting damage from Zelda 2's combat system. On top of that, it's just another change in the element that emphasizes melee sword and shield combat. The sword beam can be helpful to a limited degree, but really, most major encounters are still going to require players get close and personal with the enemies and truly learn and master countering their attack patterns. Link's standard attack that players will be using throughout the entire game is a melee sword strike. This strike sees Link lunge forwards with his sword, while still holding his shield at the same height Link is attacking. Because he lunges forwards, his sword hitbox looks like it takes up 1 full tile. I also think the hitbox is slightly larger than Link's actual sword, as I've definitely hit enemies without seeing Link's sword actually touch them. Players can also attack with the sword while crouching, and attack while jumping. Something notable about this attack, though, is that it functions differently when standing and when crouching. When standing, Link will first pull his sword back before striking. That means there's a slight delay between when players press the attack button and when Link actually strikes. Then, after attacking, he'll draw his sword back to this ready position, and players can only strike again when they see the sword in its ready position. Mash the attack button as much as you want when the sword isn't in the ready position, and Link won't perform another strike. This creates a natural buffer for when players can actually attack and hurt enemies. This is notable in Zelda 2 because, unlike Zelda 1, enemies don't actually have invincibility frames. They do flash after Link hurts them, but this is really to indicate that Link injured the enemy rather than to indicate iframes. Oddly, the crouch attack functions slightly different. While players do need to wait for the crouch attack to finish before they can attack a second time, while the normal attack sees Link initially draw back his sword in ready position before striking, the crouch attack doesn't do this, and instead immediately strikes. It makes the crouch attack slightly faster to execute than a standing attack. This also transfers to jumping. If players jump and aren't crouching during a jump, they'll perform Link's standard attack where he first draws his sword back and then strikes. Whereas if players are crouching while jumping, Link will immediately attack with his sword. I'm honestly at a bit of a loss as to why this is the case and why the game was designed this way. Link pulling back his sword before striking adds to that deliberate feel of Zelda 2, where striking takes a little more time and players need to actually plan out their attacks. But why does crouching function slightly different? I'd think, typically, you'd want to have consistency, so either both attacks have this short prep attack window, or both attacks strike immediately. The only thing I can think of is maybe the team decided that because crouch attacking takes more inputs, that makes it more complicated and would delay players' attacks slightly, and therefore they made Link strike immediately to try and feel more fair for that double input. Or perhaps they thought it could lead to more complex strategies. Want to strike immediately? Then use a crouch attack. Want to strike with a slight delay? Then use a standard standing attack. One more note about the attack is that if it's used while Link is moving, Link will immediately stop to attack. That makes the attack feel weighty and grounded. Like everything else I've been mentioning, it also makes attacking feel much more deliberate. But something important about grounded attacks like this is that it really affects how enemies and the player should feel with the use of knockbacks. So that leads me to an incredibly important element in 2D action games, and that's enemy and player knockback. In most games, if a player or enemy is hit and not destroyed, they'll be knocked back to a certain degree as an added punishment onto getting damaged. If players are near an insta-death pit, of which there are plenty in Zelda 2, then the knockback becomes extremely dangerous and can make even the most minor of enemies truly powerful, as that knockback could just lead to an instant death. But it doesn't only serve the purpose of punishment. Knockbacks also add a nice feeling of feedback and weight to weapon strikes. Striking an enemy with your sword and seeing them physically get knocked back makes your attack feel powerful. And because Link stops to strike, then knocks back enemies when he does strike them, it adds to his attacks having a nice feeling of weight to them. Link also, notably, doesn't bounce backwards after melee attacking an enemy, which is really what I wanted to get at with his melee attacks. He'll stop, his attack will knock back enemies, and he'll hold his ground. He feels strong and in control, and players aren't punished for successfully pulling off an attack. Because the enemy is knocked backwards and the player is grounded in their attack, it also naturally creates distance between the player and enemy after an attack, preventing players, typically, from spamming attack and completely neutralizing an enemy without properly addressing their attack pattern. That can fall apart when players trap enemies against walls and can then spam attack, but, you can also consider that a viable strategy. In a game where players can run while attacking, it's probably a better idea to have players bounce backwards slightly after striking an enemy with a melee attack as a sort of recoil. Otherwise, even if enemies are knocked back by your strike, players who are running will immediately run right back to the enemy they just struck and can instantly strike again, which could potentially make many encounters too simple. But this sort of thing would make the player feel much lighter and makes their attack feel less deliberate, which, for everything we've discussed, seems counter to the way that Zelda 2, Link's overall game feel, and its combat system are designed. Now, you can obviously have an added recoil for the player on top of a grounded attack like Link has, where Link would stop to strike the enemy gets knocked back, and Link also gets recoiled backwards slightly. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think that sort of thing typically works if you want to convey an enemy or object is so powerful it's causing you to recoil backwards, or your player is so light that even attacking an enemy bounces them back. You can also have a mix where weaker enemies don't cause recoil, but stronger enemies do, but clearly the team wanted Link to feel weighty. So all of this accounts for Link's basic action combat mechanics. His movement has a slow acceleration and deceleration factor to it, his jumps are short and have a minor degree of variance players can control, players are meant to stop and defend, and players are required to stop for their grounded attacks, which knocks back enemies. Players can attack and jump, but because Link's momentum will carry them without a high degree of control after choosing to do this, it makes the attack much more risky. So jump and strike with the wrong timing, and you can't course correct from potentially getting injured. As I keep saying, and probably too much, this all makes Link feel heavy and makes all of Zelda 2's action, platforming, and combat feel deliberate. Want to jump across a gap? you'll have to make sure to get a running start so you can actually cross it. But then you'll want to stop to strike an enemy so you don't accidentally slide into them. Standard attacks can be slow, and everything plays into pushing players towards facing off against each enemy without an easy means of escaping. While I've talked about how some people might like this and others might not, which is true of anything really, I do think this general framework makes sense and works within itself. All of the choices feel like they complement each other for the style of gameplay it seems like the team was going for, and I do happen to enjoy this gameplay. There are other broader issues I think Zelda 2 has that stops it from being a more widely enjoyed game and more of a cult classic, but mechanically speaking, I think the game is sound. Leave Princess Zelda in the North Castle, and players will enter into the overworld of Hyrule. As the action of Zelda 2 is now focused on side-scrolling action, the overworld instead acts similar to an RPG like Dragon Quest, where it really acts as a way to visually connect one area of the game to another. So your way to travel to towns, caves, temples, and other points of interest will be from the overworld. In some ways, on a broad scale, this is similar to Zelda 1. On its surface, Zelda 1's overworld is a series of connected scenes which players will traverse to find each dungeon they need to enter in order to find Triforce shards to complete the game. Zelda 2's overworld is a large map players will need to traverse to find each palace they need to enter in order to bring back and activate a crystal. But that's about where the similarities begin and end. Because Zelda 1's overworld has the same gameplay as its dungeons, that means that exploring its overworld is filled with all sorts of secrets and riddles players will be engaging with. It makes for a much more interesting overworld, where the overworld has a life of its own, and oftentimes for me, is even more enjoyable than exploring the dungeons. But because Zelda 2's main focus is on its side-scrolling, the overworld takes a notable hit in how interesting it is. The team still attempts to have secrets and hidden elements to the overworld, but it doesn't reach the same level as something like in Zelda 1. Most of Zelda 2's overworld secrets amount to travel to a specific tile on the map, and you'll end up in a special action sequence that could lead to a goodie like a heart container or a magic container. However, ultimately, it's simply the player walking to the correct spot on the map. Zelda 1, on the other hand, has players solving riddles like how to get through a forest maze, or using items they found in dungeons to access special locations they couldn't find before. The entire map is filled with secrets, where players can burn down trees or blow up walls and rock faces, because it's all using that same action of the dungeons. Zelda 2 attempts to have some of this, with things like a maze that players need to navigate through, or boots that allow players to travel on water with hidden routes. Certain items found in dungeons help navigate the overworld specifically, but they're usually obvious uses like destroying a boulder. It never reaches the same level of intrigue due to the type of overworld it is. To make Zelda 2's overworld more interesting, Zelda 2 includes a unique random battle system with the terrain affecting both how this system works and what random battles players will step into. If players are on a path, random battles are never triggered. However, if players go off-roading, which they'll often need to do, after a certain number of steps, a cluster of potential enemies will be spawned onto the overworld. If players then run into one of those enemies, it will trigger a side-scrolling combat sequence players are required to complete. I couldn't figure out exactly how the spawning mechanic worked, but Speed Demo's archive has a breakdown of it. According to Speed Demo's archive, there are two ways random encounters can be called, both through a timer and through the number of steps players have taken in the overworld. Although, apparently, the overworld step counter only activates after leaving the initial starting area of Zelda 2, meaning that there are less frequent random encounters in the starting zone. When the steps are active, every 16 steps, monsters spawn unless the player is on the path during the 16th step. As far as the timer is concerned, it's reset whenever you leave a side-scrolling zone to a count of 8 ticks. If it reaches 0 from a global timer, then enemies are spawned, again if players aren't on the path. Once enemies are spawned, the timer is reset with the number of ticks required for more enemies to spawn being different per terrain type Link is standing on. I find it interesting that there wasn't a random number that was assigned every time Link spawned monsters to indicate a random number of steps Link would have to walk to spawn the next encounter. So I looked into it, and it seems like generating random numbers on the NES was much more complex than I realized. I'm not an NES coder, so I don't know the exact intricacies of it, and if you're curious, there's a fantastic video by NES Hacker on RNG on the NES. It was possible to create pseudo RNG on the NES, and games certainly used it, and I'm sure the programmers of Nintendo knew how, but to my understanding, it could potentially be a slightly slower operation. So perhaps this was a clever workaround to create the feeling of randomness without needing to resort to a random number generator. And to that extent, I think they succeeded. It feels random. So all of this creates a unique system where, instead of a random battle like from a JRPG, monsters are randomly spawned, or at least feel randomly spawned. Players then have a slightly higher degree of control to avoid those encounters or choose which encounter to engage with. Anytime monster encounters are spawned, there are 3 specifically that could be spawned: an easy encounter, a challenging encounter, or if you get lucky, a fairy encounter. This is one of those things that has a regional difference, with the US version of the game having shadowy figures represent these encounters. A blob that looks like a bit represents an easy encounter, a shadow figure looking like a moblin represents a challenging encounter, and a fairy represents, well, a fairy. The original Japanese version, however, had these ghost-like figures that would spawn, with the color of the ghost dependent on the type of encounter. Zelda 2 is absolutely filled with regional differences, but for the most part, I'm not going to cover these as they don't particularly change the actual structure or design of the game. There is a major exception to this in terms of how leveling and experience works in Zelda 2, and I will definitely be touching on the regional differences there. But for all things different between the Japanese version of Zelda 2 with other regions, I'd highly recommend checking out Boundary Break's Region Break episode, Japanese Zelda 2 Was Very Different, which I've linked in the description. Zelda 2's way to handle random encounters is something that I don't think I've ever seen prior to Zelda 2, or even replicated after Zelda 2, but I actually really like this concept over the normal JRPG random battles, where a certain number of steps will automatically trigger a random battle. Random battles can feel completely out of the player's control, and can sometimes make games feel a little tedious if the encounter rate is too high. But then, if the encounter rate is too low, that could cause issues of not creating enough challenge, or allow players to level up enough in the case of an RPG. So this is a nice concept in giving players a little more control over their random encounters. Yes, these will spawn, and sometimes it is absolutely unavoidable, especially in the case of being in a swamp, which will slow players' movement down. But because you can avoid enemies sometimes, or even intentionally choose your encounter, it helps Zelda 2 sidestep some of the issues that random encounters can present for many players. Speaking on those random encounters, rather than fighting a specific monster when Link runs into a random encounter in the overworld, players are instead transported to a side-scrolling battle sequence loaded with a set number of enemies depending on the location and monster type players ran into. Players don't technically need to fight any of the monsters, and can simply skip over the sequence. Although, depending on which encounter players run into, that can be easier said than done. Like the majority of JRPGs, these encounters in the starting area start relatively simple, but rapidly become more difficult as the players progress through the game, with the final sequence of the game, the Valley of Death, being particularly brutal. Also like JRPGs, these random encounters both serve as additional challenges, making the overworld not so simple to traverse, while also providing players opportunities to grind and level up. Because the random encounters aren't relegated to a simple fight against an enemy, it feels much more in line with the actual gameplay of Zelda 2. I think the random encounters that are included actually help to connect the overworld to the action sequences even further. If players simply traveled from point A to point B on the overworld, it could feel like a disjointed way to connect seemingly disparate action sequences. But by including these random encounters, it does make traveling to each location still somewhat maintain that action gameplay. Additionally, it creates a game to the overworld, as you're not just traveling from point A to point B, but you also need to actively think about what tile you're on and if you're going to try to engage in certain random encounters or try to avoid them. There are several secrets that players can find in the overworld and hidden locations, and none of this would feel particularly challenging to find if players could simply walk there without thinking. So by introducing this system, it creates actual stakes to exploration in the overworld, and I think that's to the game's benefit. So all of this creates an interesting interplay between the overworld and action side-scrolling sections of Zelda 2. The overworld has some very minor puzzles in it, but is mostly a connective tissue completely separate from the normal gameplay of Zelda 2, which is relegated to the action sequences. This is drastically different from Zelda 1, where the overworld and dungeon gameplay were the exact same, with dungeons having a higher emphasis on combat. With Zelda 2, the overworld is supposed to serve as the exploration side of the game, while the team attempted to create what they probably felt were more interesting combat scenarios for a Zelda-like adventure through the side-scrolling sequences. The overworld was also a unique take on how to try and connect a large side-scrolling world. A counterexample would be something like Metroid, which released prior to Zelda 2, or Castlevania 2, which released after Zelda 2. In these games, the entire map, and therefore world, is interconnected through side-scrolling beats. They work fantastically within their own right, which is why the Metroidvania genre has blown up, but they're also limiting in their own way. With the Metroidvania-style interconnected map, players will often need to backtrack to prior areas in order to get where they need to go or unlock new routes. Additionally, the scope of where you're traveling is much more limited, as it needs to somewhat make sense that you can walk everywhere in the game. Even then, with only 4 directions to go, that could lead to odd architecture and choices if you want the grand type of map that Zelda 2 has. Otherwise, you'd be traveling left to right a lot if the layout was more linear, like the actual areas of Zelda 2 tend to be, which would make traversing through the world feel sluggish. Finally, you're much more limited in terms of the map layout, because everything should be connected. I absolutely adore Metroidvanias, so this isn't me harping on them. They simply present certain limitations by the nature of their design. So Zelda 2 instead attempts a different direction for how to have a sprawling 2D side-scrolling action-oriented world, and to do so, utilizes an overworld. The pros of this are that the team is able to have any type of location they want and connect them in any way they want. They don't need to worry so much about if the layout of one small cave in Death Mountain is properly connected to the layout of Midoro Palace. They don't need to worry about if traveling to and through Rauru Town is going to destroy the pace on the way from Parapa Palace and onto Midoro Palace, because players can actively choose to engage or not engage with the town when they want through this system. It also allows for a much grander scale with the visual to accompany it. The team doesn't need to worry about their game being set in one large location, but can have players visually travel across a giant world to completely disparate places. But, of course, the con is that the world won't feel as connected as a Metroidvania, and players will have less gameplay consistency as they're popping in and out of action scenes that have an action system than into a basic traversal map system. Ultimately, the question comes down to, would Zelda 2 have benefited more from being a fully interconnected side-scrolling game, a la Metroid, or does it benefit more from the Dragon Quest world map style of gameplay? Because I can see a world where heading east from Zelda's temple takes you through easy grass encounters to Rauru Town, and further east takes you through woods, then a cave, through a desert, and into the first palace. And then traveling west from Zelda's temple takes you to Rauru Town after a number of outdoor encounter areas. Taking this route, you'd lose a lot of the overworld exploration that Zelda 2 tries to include, like finding a random corner of the map that eventually leads to a heart piece, or a cave that leads to a magic container. Instead, these elements would need to be somehow hidden in the side-scrolling sections and found through exploration. While that works in most Metroidvanias, I don't think Zelda 2's gameplay particularly lends itself to this type of exploration. It works alright in dungeons thanks to elevators, but Link can't jump high, and his movement and gameplay is so focused on creating combat beats that I think it could potentially hinder this type of larger Metroidvania-esque exploration. You could certainly do it, of course, but it probably makes more sense for a larger castle structure like in Castlevania, rather than in this giant sprawling world that Zelda 2 tries to present. So, would it work and be fun? Probably, but you'd also need to completely restructure everything about the game's level layouts to make it work. And something that I like about Zelda 2 is just how different and unique it is. I imagine that's the same for many of Zelda 2's fans. So ultimately, I'm glad the overworld system was the direction the team went with. Now, while I do enjoy Zelda 2 for what it is, and like the novelty of it, honestly, if I had to choose between Zelda 2 or Zelda 1, I like the consistency of the gameplay in Zelda 1, and things like how traveling into a dungeon will give you a tool that works in both the overworld and dungeon in a similar way, creating a nice link between the two areas. That is an area where I think the interplay between the overworld of Zelda 2 and the action sequences is lacking compared to the first game. Like Zelda 1, players will find unique items in every dungeon, and a couple outside of dungeons, that will help them progress through the game. But these items specifically only work within action sequences or on the overworld. There's no mixture here, and that unfortunately only serves to make the overworld and action segments feel more disjointed. In Zelda 1, if you find or purchase a candle, you can use it to light dark rooms in dungeons, injure enemies in both dungeons and the overworld, and use it to burn down trees in the overworld. It also functions, in its action, the exact same way in both dungeons and the overworld. Find a candle in Zelda 2, and it lights up caves and action sequences, and that's it. Find boots in Zelda 2, and it's only useful in the overworld. So that is a shame, and an area that I do think could have been improved. So now that we've gone over a lot of the overall structure of the gameplay, let's go over your first moments. Upon clicking into your game, Link starts in an action side-scrolling area to Zelda 2. This immediately establishes that Zelda 2 will be different in gameplay from Zelda 1, whereas if you started in the overworld, perhaps that would be slightly less clear. But what's maybe more important is that players start right in the center of the screen and can choose to travel left or right. Both directions will have the same result, with Link leaving to the overworld, but visually, it helps to establish the context that this isn't a simple action game like Mario, where players travel from left to right, but players will want to explore in both directions. This is also a safe zone with no monsters, so it gives new players a chance to learn the basic controls without needing to worry about any imminent danger. Many modern games like to have tutorial-style stages where players learn the mechanics through play, but the basic mechanics of Zelda 2 are so simple, I think this suffices just fine. On leaving the North Palace where Zelda is sleeping, players will be thrust into the overworld. So, our first moments are learning their side-scrolling and players can explore in any direction, and then learning about the interplay between the overworld and action sequences. The overworld here has a safe path leading from the North Temple to the nearby towns of Rauru and Ruto. Players won't know the path is safe just yet, but it does give players an obvious direction for where to head. Don't know where to go? Follow the path. But the path also splits in two directions, left or right, once again indicating that players should be exploring, and that will be a theme to Zelda 2. If players do inevitably wander off the path, players will come to their first combat scenes with the random encounter system. However, in the starting zone, these are less frequent and start relatively simple. So, our starting moments are teaching players about action sequences, the overworld, and exploration. I think it's all well handled, and should quickly give players a grasp of the basic ideas and mechanics behind Zelda 2. Set off along the path, and our first destination is Rauru Town. Obviously, this doesn't have to be the player's first choice for where to go, but I do imagine most first-time players will subconsciously follow the paths to see where they go as a starting point, and end up at either Rauru Town or Ruto Town. So, before talking about Rauru Town specifically, let's talk about towns and their purpose in Zelda 2. Every town serves as an information hub, heal station, and place for players to obtain one or two new abilities. That's from a practical gameplay standpoint. From a world-building perspective, they of course help enliven and bring the world of Hyrule to life, as there are now busy and bustling towns rather than, a country filled with old hermits and shady businessmen living in caves. As I mentioned in the section about game manuals, Shigeru Miyamoto and team were well aware that many people who played Zelda 2 on the Famicom Disk System would have purchased the game through a disc writer and therefore wouldn't have a manual. So as a result, both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 feature in-game hint systems. This also helps bring the game to life, as all of the information and hints they wanted players to receive could be ascertained within the game. And in this case, towns include villagers and homes and walking by who will give clues or hints to players. So if you're stuck or lost, it's a good idea to visit a town and talk to people passing by to see if there was some sort of hint that you missed. With the multitude of random encounters, these also become safety hubs players can return to in order to heal health, and, in the case of most towns, magic. So they somewhat serve as checkpoints where players who are struggling can grind for levels around a village, and then when they're in danger and low on magic and/or health, quickly return to not game over. Generally speaking, it's a nice addition, and it's hard to imagine playing Zelda 2 without the inclusion of towns simply for their functionality of healing Link. Including magic abilities and sometimes weapon attacks players can learn in towns also helps make the towns more exciting to find. You're not just finding a rest point, but a place that can help Link to level up in his abilities, and therefore help you progress as a player. That even makes some of these villages mandatory, with some of the spells and abilities being required for actually finishing the game. To be nitpicky, they do feel a little generic and very samey. Every village looks practically the same with only minor differences, and all of the NPCs look the exact same. But it's hard to hold that against Zelda 2, considering the game was working within the limitations of the era, and there were heavy space limitations. So, reusing sprites and models was a necessity in order to fit a game on a cartridge and/or disc. From a game design standpoint, you don't technically need these towns. You could replace a town with a heal station that players step onto in the overworld. And from there, you'd probably want to scatter even more hidden places for players to find on the overworld map, with those places being where players step onto in order to find a character who teaches them a spell or a new attack, or maybe gives a hint, kinda similar to Zelda 1. In some ways, that might have played a bit deeper into Zelda 2's game design. It would see players exploring the world for more secrets, and therefore interacting with the overworld a little more. On top of that, if there was a simple heal station, it could take away a little bit of the time sink players currently need to go through if they want to heal Link. Healing Link requires players go into town, and then walk all the way over to the girl who, definitely isn't sleeping with Link to heal him, and the old lady who restores his magic, and then walk all the way back out of town. That's not the longest process, but this type of system would speed it up. What you lose in that, though, is world building and immersion that the town system creates. Yes, going into town every time you want to fully heal up can be slightly tedious, but it's more immersive than a quicker solution, and sometimes that extra bit of immersion is worth the trade-off. Additionally, the fact that it is slightly tedious to go into town and heal isn't even necessarily a bad thing. That extra time sink means it actually works as a punishment for playing poorly and needing to do this, so sometimes little inconveniences like this can actually be a positive when looking at the full picture. So I presented this alternative town solution really as what I thought was more of a fun thought exercise, because when you think about the team designing the game, it's not like having villages was a given to them, and it's fun to think about how they arrived at the conclusion that towns were the correct choice for Zelda 2. It could be something as simple as they were inspired by Dragon Quest, or that they wanted Hyrule to feel more like a living and breathing world, and having actual NPCs in towns would do the trick. But from there, you have to fill your town with something interesting from a gameplay standpoint that isn't simply NPCs to talk to, and the solution here was healing, clues, and abilities. Another interesting note about the towns are that certain doors are closed, and players will need to interact with the correct NPC in order for them to open the door and let the player in. This is different from many games, which simply lets players walk inside, and then from there we'll have the NPC tell players what they need to, or in the case of a fetch quest, tell them what they need. I actually think this is a nice change of pace from walking into every building and learning quests from within the buildings, because it means players don't have to travel as far and waste as much time in order to learn what they need to learn. There are some towns that are far more interesting in Zelda 2 than other ones, with some basic platforming for secrets. I get the starting towns not having that, but that is an element I do wish was a little more present in the towns of Zelda 2, as it makes the towns feel a little more like playgrounds, and it's fun to see how Link can travel around them rather than how the towns are usually presented in Zelda 2, which is just move across the screen from one building and NPC to another. From a progression standpoint, your first town should be Rauru Town. Rauru is the beginner town. There's no old lady to heal players for their magic, which makes sense because at this point, players probably haven't learned any magic spells yet. On top of that, in order to learn your very first spell here, this is the only town where players can learn the spell for free without needing to perform some sort of quest. So this will likely be the player's first introduction to magic, and in this case, players will be learning Shield. Outside of some hints that can be helpful, that's about all there is to the town of Rauru. So now that we have our first spell in Shield, let's talk about the magic system to Zelda 2. The tool system of Zelda 1 has been essentially replaced with a magic system. While there are tools players can find, these tools are more passive or are meant for the overworld. So while certain tools in Zelda 1 could be used offensively, instead for Zelda 2, Link will be learning magic and spells which will assist players in combat. The magic system is more limited than the tool system of Zelda 1, as magic uses MP, meaning that players have a limited amount of spells they can cast until refilling their MP. This is drastically different from Zelda 1. Certain tools like the boomerang and magical rod could be used as frequently as players wanted. The bow and arrow utilized rupees to shoot as its ammo count, and bombs were limited, with players finding more through drops or as a reward, somewhat similar to finding MP in Zelda 2's dungeons. You may have also noticed those tools I was just listing were offensive combat tools, which is also drastically different to Zelda 2's magic system. The spells of Zelda 2 are a bit of a mix, but you'll probably find yourself using defensive spells like Shield and Life the most frequently, or movement spells such as Jump and Fairy as they're required for actual movement. Link's more offensive spells come in the second half of the game through Fire, Reflect, Spell, and Thunder. But Fire is mainly useful for hurting enemies who can't be hurt with Link's normal sword. Reflect is primarily used as a defensive spell to reflect certain enemies' attacks right back at them. Spell will transform an enemy into a blue slime bot, but isn't found until one of the final villages. And Thunder is a true pure offensive tool, but it's the final spell players will find and is costly to use. The majority of spells players cast only work within the scene players use them. So if players cast Shield, Link's tunic will turn red to indicate it's in use, but they'll lose it as soon as they cross into a new scene. This goes the same for offensive spells like Fire and Reflect. Life, Spell, and Thunder are the outliers here. Life immediately partially restores Link's health, whereas Spell and Thunder affect the visible screen the moment they're used. Because these spells are fleeting, unlike the tools of Zelda 1, it makes using them feel much more strategic and consequential. All of that leads to my main point here that, while yes, there are offensive spells you'll occasionally want to cast, it's likely you'll use the defensive spells more often, which reiterates that sword and shield combat is still the primary way you'll be fighting enemies, even as you learn new spells. The magic system is also pretty unique in how it works through leveling. Unlike many JRPGs where leveling up increases the character's max MP, finding magic containers will be the way to increase Link's max MP. Instead, leveling up the magic stat in Zelda 2 decreases how much MP it costs to cast the game's spells. So each MP bar in the UI represents 16 MP. Players start with 4 bars, or 64 total MP. Players can find 4 magic containers, with each one adding 1 more bar of MP, for a grand total of 8 bars, or 128 MP. While leveling up magic decreases how much spells cost to use, this doesn't affect every spell per level up, and only certain spells will decrease in cost. I have on screen a handy chart Zelda dungeon put together, showcasing how each magic level affects each spell in terms of its cost. Shield, as our first example, initially costs 32 MP to use. However, at Magic Level 2, it costs 24 MP. Magic Level 3 won't change this at all, and then Magic Level 4 will decrease this to 16, which is where it settles. That creates an interesting combination, where both leveling up magic and exploring to find magic containers are both incredibly useful ways to increase your magical abilities, but in different ways. The way leveling up works to decrease the cost of spells also helps ensure Zelda 2 maintains a certain level of balance and never becomes too easy through magic. For example, later on in the game, Link will learn the incredibly useful spell of Life, which will restore 3 bars of health on use. This initially costs over 4 bars of MP to use, as it's useful. Through leveling up magic, this will eventually drop to costing just over 3 bars of MP, but it will never drop below that amount. So the spell does become slightly easier to cast as players level up, but never to a point where players can abuse it. The final ingredient to Zelda 2's magic system is in magic jars. Whereas Zelda 1 had a drop system with a large assortment of potential drops, including rupees, health, or bombs, Zelda 2's drops are much more limited and relegated to magic jars or treasure/P bags. The magic jars can be a blue jar which restores 1 bar of MP, or a red jar which fully restores MP. As players utilize magic so much for defense, magic jars become absolutely vital to players' progress through dungeons, as it will allow players to cast shield and prevent enemies from damaging them too much, or cast life to heal when their health gets too low. Gone are health drops, meaning in the vast majority of dungeons, healing, once you obtain the spell, is going to be your only way to restore health. Before talking about the magic system as a whole, let's quickly talk about each spell and their effect. Casting Shield turns Link's tunic red and cuts all damage he receives in half. This spell is never not useful, and anytime a room presents danger or a difficult enemy, it's a spell players will want to cast, as receiving half damage will drastically increase their longevity in a dungeon. This spell will run out the moment players leave the scene they cast it in. Casting Jump will double Link's jump height. While this can be used to help with combat, and is sometimes necessary, it's mostly used for required traversal. This spell will also run out the moment players leave their current scene. Casting Life will restore 3 bars of health to Link. Casting Fairy will turn players into a fairy that can fly in all directions. This is another tool that's required for certain traversal, although you can also use it to break the game, and the spell ends when players leave their current scene. Casting Fire will allow Link to shoot fireballs out of his sword. While this adds range to Link's attack, really, it's meant for attacking certain enemies who are impervious to Link's normal attack. It doesn't help damage more difficult enemies like Iron Knuckles. Casting Reflect will allow Link to block and deflect certain attacks with his shield that he wouldn't be able to otherwise. This is an incredibly situational spell that's primarily meant to be used against specific wizard enemies, but can also defend against certain projectiles without reflecting them back Link otherwise wouldn't be able to. Like most spells, Reflect will stop working as soon as players leave the scene they cast it in. Casting Spell within combat will turn enemies who aren't immune to the spell into blue bots. This is an incredibly useful spell for getting out of difficult situations. Casting Thunder will hurt all enemies on screen with the power of 2 level 8 sword attacks. While that's incredibly powerful, the spell at magic level 8 costs 64 MP, which is half of Link's full MP. So what this full system does is make magic incredibly important to combat, and something that is genuinely rewarding to upgrade through levels and magic containers, and genuinely rewarding to find as a drop. You'll find yourself consistently managing when to best cast Shield in order to prevent yourself from losing too much damage during difficult encounters in dungeons, and then balancing that with casting Life, as that's the only way to heal in just about every dungeon, but then also not casting Shield when you think you can handle the situation safely. Because enemies can drop magic jars, and you can also find magic jars in dungeons, it also means that enemy drops are incredibly important for refilling your magic, meaning even defeating basic enemies like bots can be important purely for the sake of refilling your NP. I think the system is very well managed in Zelda 2, with each spell having a unique and specific purpose. Because the magic system is so useful, it means every upgrade and drop around it are rewarding. You'll also very likely find yourself flipping through various spells throughout the course of each dungeon, which is different than Zelda 1. In Zelda 1, I'd find the tool I like the most, like the boomerang, and pretty much just stick to that unless I wanted to quickly swap to a bomb for extra offense. In Zelda 2 though, I found myself consistently thinking about MP and which spells to cast for each given situation. Granted, that was usually shield or life. While you are granted powerful offensive spells, because MP is so expensive and limited, magic doesn't take away from how important the sword and shield combat of Zelda 2 is, but rather serves as an extra bonus that either enhances it through defense or occasionally can save you in a moment of desperation. Additionally, because leveling up magic in Zelda 2 only drops certain spell costs per level up and not all of the spell costs, it means that none of the spells become too OP or something players can overuse, helping to keep the game balanced even into its final hours. Regardless of how you feel about Link using magic, as far as a gameplay system goes, I think the magic system in Zelda 2 is very well done. But a big part of the reason the magic system works so well, and is so important, is because of how different item drops are, and as I mentioned, because item drops no longer drop health. So that brings me to talking about item drops in Zelda 2. As I mentioned, Zelda 1's item drops included rupees for its shop system, health drops such as hearts or fairies, clocks that would stop all enemies on your current screen, significantly helping with combat, or bombs. There was a system to this, with certain enemies dropping certain items based on their group, and a slightly convoluted forced drop system hinted at, but one that I imagine most players won't understand, making this system feel random. Like Zelda 1, Zelda 2 also has a drop system, where the 6th enemy you defeat will drop either a P-Bag, which is extra experience, or a magic jar. Whether the magic jar is blue or red, or the P-Bag contains 50 or 200 EXP, all depends on the strength of the enemy the player killed as their 6th enemy. According to Speed Demo's archive, there are 3 enemy types, one with no drops, enemies in the small group, and enemies in the large group. A kill counter maintains how many in each group type you've killed, and you'll receive a drop specifically on the 6th kill of the enemy in that category. So if you kill 4 Iron Knuckles, then 2 bots, you won't receive a drop from the 2nd bot. But that counter of 4 strong enemies continues, and killing 2 more enemies in the strong category will still net players a drop, with all of this helping to make the system feel random. To add to this, the type of drop you get is random, with you more likely to get a blue jar over a 50 EXP P-Bag from small enemies, and a 50-50 chance you'll get a red jar or 200 EXP P-Bag from large enemies. This is something speedrunners often take advantage of, and if you haven't watched speedrunners like Error72 specifically utilize the drop system for their speedruns, it's an entertaining watch, and I've linked to Error72's SGDQ 2017 speedrun in the description. For our purposes, the main takeaway is that these drops should feel random, and instead of the plethora of drop types in Zelda 1, you're only getting one of 2 drop types in Zelda 2, experience points or magic refills. As bombs and a shop system no longer exist, those make sense. But what's particularly interesting is that there are no longer health drops, which I'll touch on in a moment. The drop system of Zelda 2 adds a nice additional incentive for killing enemies. That already exists more so than Zelda 1 thanks to the added experience points players will get for defeating enemies, but this makes it extra worthwhile to even destroy smaller enemies, as that can lead to a magic jar, which can greatly help players through a dungeon. So, all of that leads me nicely into the next topic, which is healing in Zelda 2 compared to Zelda 1. In both games, players can find special locations to fully heal, whether that be fairy fountains in Zelda 1, or fairies and kind women in Zelda 2. But the main way players will be healing in dungeons for Zelda 1 is through the item drop system. If you're taking damage, you'll have to grind away and hope that an enemy drops a heart. Or you can use the shop system to purchase a potion ahead of time, and therefore have a safety net if things get particularly rough. In Zelda 2, as there are no longer health drops and there are no items players can purchase to heal, all of Link's healing is completely dependent on utilizing the life spell to heal Link for 3 health bars. The first dungeon of Parapa Palace includes a fairy, but otherwise, that's it. And because healing is so limited, that makes playing well and proper spell usage all the more important. It's part of what makes the shield spell so incredibly useful in Zelda 2, because taking damage is that much more significant of a hurdle with the lack of healing. It becomes equally important to manage your MP alongside your HP, as your MP not only manages your shield spell, but also your life spell, and that life spell is going to cost roughly at least half of your starting MP. Because MP becomes such a valuable resource due to this, that makes enemies dropping blue and red jars all the more important, and drastically increases the importance of the enemy drop system and destroying every enemy you find. It also encourages extra exploration and experimentation, because once players realize attacking certain statues can result in magic jar drops, they'll probably start attacking everyone they see with the hopes this will give them a much needed MP refill. Now, comparing Zelda 1 to Zelda 2, I don't know if I'd say one system for healing is necessarily better than the other, but I do think Zelda 2's magic healing system encourages more caution and better play. Because heart and fairy drops are fairly frequent in Zelda 1, you're not nearly as punished for playing a little sloppy. But Zelda 2 ain't having that, which is just one part that's led to Zelda 2's reputation for being as difficult as it is. It's not the main culprit, that would be the lives and game over system of Zelda 2, which I will get to, but it is certainly a major contributing factor. I actually like both healing systems, but Zelda 2's is probably the more thoughtful system because it's a healing system that plays directly into the MP and spell system of Zelda 2 and does encourage defensive play, once again playing into the major gameplay mechanics of Zelda 2. After visiting Rauru Town and obtaining the shield spell, it is time to find Parapa Palace, which, as we've been hinted to, is the location of the candle players will need to properly traverse caves. The way journeying to Parapa Palace is handled, though, is immediately an interesting decision that is pretty telling of what Zelda 2's design philosophy and overall difficulty will be. Players begin trapped in the northwest portion of Hyrule. The only places to go are Rauru Town, Ruto Town, or off the beaten path and into one of 4 caves. Every cave will be pitch black, meaning from the standpoint of a brand new player who doesn't know where to go, each one is an equally bad option. But there are a couple clues that can help with this. In Rauru Town, you'll receive the clue, get candle in Parapa Palace, go west. And in Ruto Town, you'll receive the clue, do not go south without a candle. So, don't go south without a candle eliminates 2 of the 4 caves. The northern cave, which turns out to be the location of a needed trophy, is the wrong direction according to your clue about where the candle is. So, that leaves the cave west of Rauru Town. What's interesting about this cave, though, is that there's an enemy in it players can't see. I mean, if you really pay attention, you kinda see it scuttling along the bottom, but I don't think that was intentional. So, most players who are playing this game for their first time will likely go into the cave, get injured and have no idea from what, and possibly think they went the wrong direction. I do think this is a questionable choice. I get the idea of having danger lurking, and it's interesting to force players into a cave to see how difficult it is without having a candle to light the way. But because players are forced to go through this cave with no proper way to see an enemy, it's a discouraging element that can hurt Link and make players wonder if they're even going the correct direction, regardless of the clues. To me, it seems like this would have been a cave where you put no danger, whereas you fill the other 3 caves with danger. Yes, it's dark and players can't see, but trust the clues that you received and you'll make it safely through. That one single enemy seems counterintuitive to that. Now, once you know the enemy is there, and this is the correct cave to go through, none of this is difficult. Make it through that cave, and it's a short walk through a desert to Parapa Palace. So here we are at Parapa Palace and Zelda 2's first dungeon. Like other dungeons you'll eventually find, Parapa Palace begins with players taking an elevator into the dungeon portion of it, which then presents a choice for players to head left or right. And I think that's the key for how the team wanted to present the dungeons. They needed a way for the player to explore and not simply travel from one direction to another. So by lowering into the dungeon, they're now free to have any dungeon layout they want without worrying about the start of every dungeon seeing players travel from left to right. With Zelda 1, the team could easily make interesting dungeon layouts simply by virtue of there being 4 possible directions players could go. But with Zelda 2 and the side-scrolling mechanics of the game, as well as a combat-focused character who's not meant for platforming, the team had to figure out a way to make dungeons more interesting and not simply traversing from one end to the other end. So that's where they introduced an elevator system as Link's primary way to travel up and down, therefore adding back in 4 potential directions players can travel. To start the dungeon, there are incredibly simple enemies in these Wosus. The Wosus simply run across the screen with no real attack and can be instantly killed. The point though is that they present a simple timing challenge that isn't too difficult, but does force players to be more reactionary, as opposed to some of the random encounters thus far, where players were allowed to take their time in combat. Head the traditional direction and go to your right, and players will immediately come to a locked door. Head to your left, and players will be forced to face a more complex enemy in a Stalfos, but be rewarded with a key at a dead end. So if you head to the right first, you'll quickly need to turn around and go to the left for a key. If you head to the left first, you'll find a key, but run into a dead end, and therefore need to turn around and head to the right towards the door the key can be used for. This is a nice way to quickly teach players the mechanics of dungeons. There will be locked doors, and you'll need to find keys to unlock them. The path that has more danger, in this case with the Stalfos, will probably have something you need beyond the danger. And finally, the dungeons will require you to explore in order to progress. Moving deeper into the dungeon, we get a choice that also defines the dungeons going forwards. There's an elevator players can head down, or they can ignore it and continue to move forwards. If you head down, you'll be brought to a path to the left, which will take you to a series of more difficult enemies in a Gooma and an Iron Knuckle, with defeating them leading to a locked door and the candle behind it. And if you head to the right and past the elevator, you'll find another elevator that can take you up or down, and past it, a one-time use fairy that will fully revive your health. Take the bottom path, and players will find a locked door, a series of enemies, and if players clear all of that, the boss of Parapa Palace. Take the top path, and players will find both of the keys they need for the dungeon. So the reason I bring all of this up as a collection is that you can take the initial elevator down and end up at a dead end with no key to help you progress. You can then do the exact same thing to yourself with the path to the boss. So yes, this means you'll have to explore, but it also means you could take the wrong route and then need to double back and potentially die as a consequence of simply taking the wrong route. Now, Zelda 2 makes it so, if you're in a dungeon, killing a strong enemy will result in them being permanently dead until you leave the dungeon or get a game over. So lose a life and die, and it's not like you've lost all of your progress, even if you took the wrong route, as you'll have cleared the way for yourself on returning to this route. Additionally, both finding a key and using a key are permanent, regardless of game over. So if you find a key that was past a tough challenge, you'll still have that key, and not have to worry about re-tackling the challenge even on getting a game over. But you can see where this becomes a potential issue, especially in a game like Zelda 2, which is known for its difficulty. All of the dungeons are like this, and I feel like a lot of times, your first time entering a new palace will be more about exploring the general layout rather than a true run to actually complete the palace. Obviously that's the goal, but there's so much potential for taking wrong routes, and therefore taking more damage than you would on the correct route, it can lead to more deaths and therefore more game overs. This is compounded by the healing system of Zelda 2, where your chances for making mistakes are much more limited than Zelda 1. In Zelda 1, if you take a wrong route, well, no big deal. The combat's not that challenging, you can often skip combat completely if you want by walking around it, and if you're injured, there's always a chance of getting health drops. But in Zelda 2, your chances of completing a dungeon are very much limited to how much magic power you have, which is much more limited. You can, of course, grind for MP drops, but that's a much longer process than simply finding health drops in Zelda 1. So that makes the dungeons of Zelda 2 much different upon replays than on initially playing the game. That's true of any game, of course, but I think there's more of a stark contrast with Zelda 2 because of just how much knowing the correct route makes a difference in your odds of making it through a palace your first time visiting. It means your first time, or maybe even several times in the palace, depending on how well you play, are purely about exploration and discovering locked doors and routes. Then on replays, I think the dungeons actually become more enjoyable because at that point, you're going to be taking the optimal routes, at least as well as you can remember them. It is worth noting that even if you take dead-end routes by coming across locked doors, because of Zelda 2's leveling system, killing tough enemies is almost always a positive anyways, as it can lead to a level up, so you'll probably still feel at least somewhat rewarded for completing the challenge. Now, I get what Zelda 2 is going for in wanting players to actually explore and feel a nice sense of exploration and puzzle solving in their dungeons, similar to what Zelda 1 gives players. And I do think they did what they could within their system to try and manage the downsides of this the best they could, by keeping strong enemies dead when players haven't left the dungeon or gotten a game over, and by ensuring keys and unlocked doors are remembered. But it does lead to the question, could they have done more, or were their choices the best they could have been to your tastes? Let's take this first elevator down as an example. The team decides to let players go through 3 challenge rooms before revealing a locked door, and that players went the wrong way before obtaining a key. Was that really the best choice here, or would it have been better to place the locked door earlier, say at the end of the first challenge room and before the second one? The argument against this is that it makes the dungeons feel less like you're exploring, and getting a little lost and running into a dead end helps make these dungeons feel a little more immersive. If every locked door area were obvious right when you came to it, well, the correct path is obvious, and you aren't actually doing any exploration. After all, when you really think about dungeons and labyrinths in video games, a lot of times they take the shape of basic mazes. Mazes have dead ends, which is part of what makes them fun to solve. And if you like doing mazes, there's no reason this wouldn't translate well to a video game. I think the reason this stands out compared to something like Zelda 1 is that the combat system is much slower in that every encounter is meaningful, heading the wrong direction can lead to far more backtracking, and losing lives in Zelda 2 is a significantly larger setback than in Zelda 1. So heading the wrong direction is much more consequential than a fun little whoopsie. For my part, I enjoy the initial exploration of the dungeons, and I do think getting lost in them a little bit is part of the fun of exploring. The fact that you know difficult enemies will stay dead on losing a life, and getting keys carries over through game overs always made me feel like I was making progress, even if I didn't have the best dungeon run. But I also do think Zelda 2 has a difficulty issue, but I attribute that more to how the game over system works more so than to how the dungeons work. Parapa Palace is pretty simple, and I don't think you run into that here, which is why I haven't touched on the system yet, and really, even though I dug into the overall palace design a little bit here, I actually like Parapa Palace a lot, and always have fun with the combat encounters, which really goes to show Zelda 2's strength is in its combat. One more thing I want to touch on is that Parapa Palace is the only palace, outside of the Great Palace, that has a ferry. It's likely no coincidence then that Parapa Palace is the only palace the developers expected players to go to without having a chance to get the life spell for healing. The second palace is Midoro Palace, which is right by the water town of Saria, where you'll be obtaining the life spell. And to get to Saria, you're expected to have the candle from Parapa Palace. So I think the ferry is a clever inclusion here, and I can see why it's only here in Parapa Palace, as future dungeons expect you to utilize the magic system for healing. Before moving on to our first boss of Horsehead, I want to touch on the key system of Zelda 2 a little bit further. Zelda 2's key system is notable compared to Zelda 1, in that every key players find will be specific to that dungeon. This is unlike Zelda 1, where every key was basically a one-time use skeleton key and could be used on any door in any dungeon. So why the change from Zelda 1? Well, as I talked about in Zelda 1, having a universal key system allows players to sequence break the game and not necessarily attempt every intended challenge of a dungeon. That plays into Zelda 1's free-form open-world style of gameplay and is likely the reason the team utilized that system. Hell, many dungeons even have walls players can blow up to entirely avoid using a key and therefore save one for future use, so that idea is built into Zelda 1. But Zelda 2 is a much more linear game than Zelda 1. For the most part, it's pretty expected you'll probably progress from one dungeon to the next in the expected linear fashion, especially as you'll typically need the treasure from the prior dungeon in order to even reach a following dungeon. Additionally, because Zelda 2 has a strict lives and game over system, where getting a game over will set players all the way back to the very beginning of the game, unlocking doors and dungeons is the only progression that will carry over through a game over. Finally, it speaks to the team wanting players to engage with the intended challenges of the dungeons and not be able to work their way around them. I'm not sure if you could softlock yourself out of completing Zelda 2 if the keys were skeleton keys like in Zelda 1, but that's also one less concern. So it's probably a combination of those reasons that key usage is now strictly limited to the dungeons they're found in. Make it through Parapa Palace, and players will reach their first boss in Horsehead. Horsehead, or Mazura in Japanese, is pretty simple. He wields a spiked mace and will strike at the player when he's close. As his head is exposed, hurting him requires players to jump up and attack his exposed head. Attacking his head or armor will result in Horsehead being knocked back and therefore taking away any of his danger. While he's a simple boss fight, he's made more challenging simply due to how jumping and attacking in the air works. As I mentioned in the mechanics section of the video, when players jump, unless they press backwards, they are going to maintain their velocity in the air, and that remains true for when attacking. So that can actually make this a little tricky, as players will have to properly time their jumps and attacks, which is made more difficult to aim with Horsehead moving back and forth, and any mistake could lead players to jumping right into Horsehead and taking damage for that reason, or not jumping far enough, then being attacked with his mace. Jumping and attacking is a skill players haven't actually needed yet, so it's interesting the team has chosen to force the mechanic in a boss fight as its first required use. But I do think this makes for a good, simple challenge, and I think Horsehead is a good starting boss. For defeating Horsehead, players will gain some experience points, and then be able to place a crystal in Parapa Palace. Placing a crystal in any palace automatically gives players all of the experience they need for their next level up, so now is the perfect time to finally talk about the leveling system in Zelda 2. While the Zelda franchise often gets compared to the RPG genre, a key mechanic of the RPG genre, to my mind, is leveling up and experience points, so I've always thought of Zelda as adventure games. Zelda 1 has no experience points, and instead, the way you strengthen your character is through exploration and finding various upgrades that in some ways amount to a similar thing to leveling up. Finding heart containers and increasing your max health is comparable to leveling up and receiving more max HP. It's similar for finding a sword upgrade or a defense upgrade, where you're exploring to find those things rather than obtaining them through defeating enemies and obtaining experience. Really, it's a system that works well for a game like Zelda, which is all about exploration. Zelda 2, however, uses a traditional leveling system where defeating enemies rewards players with experience points, and after obtaining enough experience points, they level up, and their stats are upgraded through these level ups. So, whereas Zelda 1's system put a higher emphasis on exploration, Zelda 2's system instead puts a higher emphasis on combat, which we're seeing a pattern here. The gameplay mechanics are all built around combat, the side-scrolling view is built around combat, and the dungeon design is more so built around combat over the exploration of Zelda 1. I do think this was the right call for Zelda 2. When I think about finding heart containers or magic containers, it's usually through stepping on a random tile on the overworld map that just happens to lead to the upgrade and reward. It doesn't feel as much like exploration because you're not using interesting game mechanics to find the rewards, you're just stepping on a correct tile. Because platforming is more difficult in Zelda 2, while there are interesting secrets and concepts that evoke exploration, like invisible walls and dungeon pit drops, even then, exploration in dungeons feels far more limited than the other Zelda games. As I hinted at earlier, an experience and leveling system like this helps to promote combat and makes defeating enemies feel much more rewarding than in a game like Zelda 1, which lacks experience points. And in a game with a combat focus, I think that's a good match. Once you actually level up, instead of a generic stat increase, players will get to choose if they want to level up life, magic, or their attack. These stats are confusing though, and I think are conveyed poorly. In the Famicom Disk System release, these stats simply say attack, magic, life. However, in the North American NES release, the subtext "will go up" is added if the player can actually choose that option, which I'll touch on in a moment. However, none of this accurately conveys what's happening. Life will go up makes it sound like the player's max health will increase, which isn't correct. By upgrading your attack, that's simple enough, and your sword attack strength will be increased. By leveling up your magic, your max MP doesn't increase, which is what this sounds like, but instead, as I went over in the spell section, the amount of MP it costs to perform certain spells will lower, with all of that depending on the level. Leveling your life doesn't increase your max HP, which again is what that sounds like to me. Rather, it increases your defense points, meaning attacks hurt Link for less. So on the surface, sure, you're upgrading those stats when you choose them, but how the upgrade functions isn't properly conveyed. Outside of the slight confusion, I think this is a good system. It gives the player power to choose what upgrade best serves their playstyle, and even allows players to skip certain level stats if they choose. If you don't care too much about magic and want to focus on sword combat, you can skip early magic levels to reach that attack stat as soon as possible. All of this is then nicely balanced in the way experience points work with leveling up. In the NES version of Zelda 2, each stat is tied to a specific number of points to level them up. So, to start, it costs 50 points to level up defense, 100 points to level up magic, and 200 points to level up attack. Once you choose to upgrade that stat, it will then increase how much that one stat specifically costs to level up. So, your first attack level costs 200 experience points, your third attack level costs 500 experience points, and your fourth attack level costs 1000 experience points. So while yes, you can save your EXP for that sword level up, once it costs 1000 EXP to level up your attack and only 50 EXP to level up your defense, it probably doesn't make too much sense to save the 50 EXP anymore, and makes much more sense to go ahead and spend the EXP on health. To also balance this, the team also added an interesting risk and reward system to leveling up. You are only allowed to level up when you hit the experience points required for one of the stats you need. So, in the starting example again, once you hit 50 EXP, you're allowed to level up health. If you skip the upgrade, you're not allowed to go back and change your mind to upgrade it. Instead, you'll need to wait until you get 100 EXP, which is the cost for the magic upgrade, and then you'll be allowed to choose to upgrade either magic or life, with life still only costing 50 EXP. If you skip this level up again, you'll have to wait until you hit 200 EXP, which is how much it costs to upgrade attack at this point, and then you'll finally be allowed to level up either attack, magic, or life. On top of that, the wrinkle that really makes that risk-reward system work is that getting a game over in Zelda 2 resets your accumulated experience points to 0, but any stat upgrade you get sticks, and you get to keep that even upon a death. So, let's say you choose to upgrade your attack twice and have a sword level of 3. If you then skip the 50 EXP requirement for life and the 100 EXP requirement for magic, you won't be allowed to choose to level up anything until you hit 1000 EXP. Meaning, if you take a risk to do this and get a game over with 900 EXP accumulated, you'll lose all of that and end up back at 0 when you could have simply leveled up your lower stats. I think this is a great system. It adds an interesting risk to choosing to go on one track and only level up one stat. It also properly scales how much experience is required for each stat to ensure players don't overlevel. And it encourages players to level up all of their stats. Even if you don't think you like magic or are going to use it very much when you first start playing Zelda 2, it's pretty likely that once you start reaching higher and higher levels, you'll still upgrade your magic anyways, because it'll be a much lower cost than the other stats. This helps ensure players don't fall too far behind, as all of these stats are genuinely important and will make a huge difference in your progress. Now, this system for upgrading your levels is notably different from the original Famicom Disk System version. I've been bouncing around in the footage I use from the NES version of the game to the Nintendo Switch NES Online Classic Game Library version, and using my Famicom Mini for the original Japanese Famicom Disk System version of the game. And something you might have noticed every now and then from my footage is that sometimes when I've shown level ups, unlike the NES version of the game, there's no points next to the stats players choose to upgrade in the Famicom Disk System version. That's because, in the Famicom Disk System version of Zelda 2, instead of having experience points required and scaled per stat, experience points required scale a little different. Your first level up, regardless of stat, costs 50 EXP. Your second and third level ups, again, regardless of stat, cost 100 EXP. From there, it seems to work as a set of threes. Every 3 level ups, the required amount of EXP scales up. But no matter what, you can always choose what stat you level up. So I played around with this and leveled up my strength to 8 and life to 3 before I finally bit the dust and got a game over. And that is where the other major change comes into play. Whenever you game over, all of your stats will reset to whatever your lowest level is. So in this instance, my stats were 8 strength, 1 magic, and 3 life. So all of my stats reset to 1. In my other playthrough, when I played more traditionally and upgraded my stats to 3 strength, 3 magic, and 4 life, getting a game over reset all of my stats to level 3. This is such a drastically different system. It allows for far more experimentation because it's cheaper to experiment. If you want to play the game with an insane attack power, well, you can, but you run a much higher risk when doing so. Because the amount of EXP per level up consistently scales up regardless of what stats you level up, it means that your safety stat, or your lowest stat, will also be more expensive to upgrade as time goes on. For this reason, overall, you actually need less experience points in the Famicom Disk System version of Zelda 2 compared to the US version, because anytime you level up one stat, you are now at risk of losing that stat through a game over until you upgrade the other two. So while yes, it might only cost 700 EXP to level up your sword to level 4, whereas the NES version requires 1000 EXP for sword level 4, it'll cost another 1400 EXP minimum to keep that stat safe in the Japanese version, as you'll need to level up both life and magic to level 4 in order to ensure your sword stat is safe from a game over. I've seen differing opinions on which version is easier, the Famicom Disk System version or the NES version. I'd wager that for newer players, the NES version is easier because all of your stats are safe, even if they require more to upgrade per level up. This system does make a major difference at the end, making the Famicom Disk System easier. Once you're at max stats of 8, 8, and 8, gaining enough EXP will result in an extra life. For the NES version, this will cost 9000 EXP, whereas it's only 4000 EXP in the Famicom Disk System version. That aside, which system is better? I think in terms of experimentation and even replayability, the Famicom Disk System is stronger because it's easier to go wild with crazy and risky builds. But I do think the NES version is the more polished version of this level up system. The safety net of retaining your level no matter what in the NES version, I think significantly helps with the difficulty of Zelda 2. On top of that, it allowed the team to properly balance how much each stat should truly cost per level up. Because, look, I leveled up my strength stat to 8 in the Famicom Disk System version and defeated the Midoro boss, Helmethead, in just 2 hits. While that was fun to do, when I played the game normally on the Famicom Disk System, I found losing stat levels to be a little too frustrating, and I do think the NES version solves that issue. With Horsehead defeated, it's off to Midoro Palace. This will require players obtain the jump ability through a minor fetch quest, make it through a cave, and then trudge through a marsh in a section of the overworld that has far less roads and safety nets for players. Overall, I think this is a nice step up in difficulty and progression. It's worth noting that the cave to Midoro Palace is dark and has a tall jump, so if players want to progress through here, they'll first need to go to a dark cave on the northern end of Hyrule for a trophy required to get the jump ability, then go through another dark cave and use that jump ability in order to progress. The second cave has boomerang tossing enemies who should be difficult for newer players, and especially when you can't see them. So all of this highly encourages players to first obtain the candle from Parapa Palace, which will light up the caves, which plays into Zelda 2 being far more linear than Zelda 1. There is an optional town for this section, Saria. Saria houses the life spell, which, as I mentioned, is Link's way to heal. In order to get the spell though, there's another fetch quest. A lady requests a mirror, and players can find that mirror by interacting with a random table in an empty house. It feels a little lazy to me that the fetch quest here was literally one screen over and inside a house. It makes the whole thing feel a little pointless. I'm not someone who hates fetch quests in general, and I think they can be fine. I actually mostly like how they're handled in Zelda 2, which I'll get to later. Perhaps this one was extra simple and basic to help teach players a lesson that it's time to actually start exploring towns a little further, and that the towns are becoming more complex than the two starting towns. So in the context of that, I can understand the reasoning here. There's more to Saria Town, including a certain slime and bridge crossing, but all of that will come later. For crossing through the marshes, which is what this is probably supposed to be as opposed to a swamp, players will reach their second dungeon in Midoro Palace. Just like how traveling to Midoro Palace was a step up from traveling to Parapa Palace, Midoro Palace is another big step up in difficulty. Instead of only 2 possible routes to start players off, there are immediately 5 possible routes over the course of multiple floors. By now, players will already be aware of the way dungeons, keys, key items to find, and multiple routes work, so I think this was a good way to immediately set Midoro Palace apart from Parapa Palace. If players immediately head to their left, they'll find a locked door and then likely be incentivized to search the other routes, which contain not just 1, but 2 total keys. It's worth noting that missing one of these will eventually screw players over, potentially in a pretty major way, and it's what happened to me my first time replaying Zelda 2 for this video, as I'd forgotten the dungeon and its layout. If you proceed through the top left door with only 1 key, this will eventually lead to 2 possible routes. One that's blocked by, well, blocks, with no way Link can progress, and the other that will lead players through falling blocks and eventually another locked door. Missing the key and going the wrong direction plays into what I talked about during the Parapa Palace section, where you'll have to backtrack through 7 large hallways of challenges just to start going in the direction of the key you missed. That means you'll then have to backtrack through this yet again to get back to where you were, meaning instead of completing 7 rooms, you've now gone through 21 rooms. So that's a good example of what I was talking about in Parapa Palace, where this can pretty readily lead to lost lives or a game over. I like getting lost in dungeons, I like exploring, and I actually love mazes, but I do think this might have been overkill in this example. But again, it's really just a design difficulty in Zelda 2, because I get it, it makes sense for these dungeons and labyrinths to feel like mazes, but the combat system takes so much time, and backtracking also takes so much time in Zelda 2, and game overs, which I'll get to in a moment, lead to such an extra time sink. That's where I think a lot of frustration for many players comes from in Zelda 2. In order to reach the dungeon's key item, which is the handy glove, players will need to pass through an area with falling blocks. The blocks will hurt Link if they fall on him, and once they hit the ground, they instantly become floor tiles that players can jump on. These blocks are falling around a tempting P-bag, and going for this P-bag, or even just this section in general, can cause players to become trapped by the blocks as they create a wall around you, and potentially lead to an unavoidable death. That's more likely to happen if you go for the P-bag, but I do think that it's possible even if you don't due to the random nature of these blocks falling. This is another area I'd flag as being a problem, partially because the random nature of the blocks falling makes it incredibly difficult to properly avoid them without taking any damage, and that seems like a flaw to me, and partially because you can get trapped. I think I get the idea of this though, and why it's here. The treasure just past this, the handy glove, allows Link to attack and break these types of blocks. So it's also the way to get past the roadblock in the bottom route I pointed out. So the reason these are likely here is the team trying to force players to learn by playing that attacking with your sword after getting the handy glove will result in destroying these blocks. Because unless you read the manual, which again, the team didn't know if players would have or not, you wouldn't know what this new item's function is, or even have a good way to guess it. There's another issue here though, which is that the team can't force players to interact with the blocks, because after the falling block sequence is the locked door I mentioned earlier that can force players to backtrack without ever getting the handy glove, and I feel like the team could have killed 2 birds with 1 stone here. There's a locked door that leads into the falling block sequence. If that were the only locked door, it would be slightly less rooms players would need to backtrack through if they found out they were missing a key. On top of that, this room with the falling blocks could have been made where the falling blocks only trigger in a section of the stage after Link has passed through where they're falling. And let's also say they fall faster, meaning they block players and prevent players from backtracking until they can destroy the blocks. That would make it so players are guaranteed to get the glove, and the only way out is by being forced to learn how to use the glove on these blocks. Attacking is such a basic mechanic, I don't think it's too far-fetched to think players might desperately attack the block walls with the sword and accidentally discover how the glove works. One more section I want to bring up is this section near the end of the dungeon, where players can go past an elevator to collect a key, or go down that elevator in order to progress through a dangerous lava drop portion with ground that breaks below Link from standing on it, and eventually to a locked door before the boss. Once again, if players don't have the key, it means they're going to need to backtrack. But this is a shorter backtrack, and one that contains a far more interesting challenge if you need to do the backtrack. Now, instead of falling down this crumbling ground section, which is pretty easy, players will need to climb back up it, and the difficulty here is that Link can't normally jump high enough to do this. But players can puzzle out that their brand new jump spell, which was required to get here, will be their ticket out. I think that's actually a very cool challenge and idea, and it's the sort of thing that would have elevated this potential backtracking instead of causing tedium, to my opinion. The only issue here is that jump uses magic, and there's a chance players will be out of magic and completely SOL. So to that end, there's this concept introduced in Midoro Palace of these red and blue slimes that drop, with the blue ones turning into bots. Really, I think one of these slime droppers should have been placed here as a safety catch for players who might need it at no real fault of their own. From an individual challenge standpoint, there are some good challenges that slightly step up the difficulty from Parapa Palace, but I do think Midoro Palace has a number of flaws, as I pointed out, that make it a dungeon more enjoyable on repeat playthroughs when you do know the proper route. With all of the potential for wrong routes in Midoro Palace, if you haven't game overed yet, I think there's a good chance this will be a newer player's first time getting a game over. So it's time to finally talk about the lives and game over system of Zelda 2, which is something drastically different from Zelda 1, and really any Zelda game, and part of the reason the game has its difficulty reputation that it has, and I think a large reason for why the game is so divisive beyond its differing gameplay. For comparison, in Zelda 1, players had infinite lives. If they died in the overworld, they would start back at the starting location of the game. If they died in a dungeon, they would return to the start of the dungeon. The major thing players were docked as a punishment, outside of progress lost, was that they'd only have 3 hearts. Otherwise, it was a fairly minor setback. Zelda 2, instead, gives players a total of 3 lives. If a player loses a life, they'll return back to the beginning of whatever screen they were on, but be given their full health and full MP back. So it's even less of a setback than from Zelda 1. The only true thing they're losing here is, if they made progress on that screen, they'll be back at the start, and all of the enemies who players were in the middle of fighting and having killed will also be given their health back. But if players lose all 3 of their lives, they'll receive a game over. And outside of the Great Palace, which is the final location of the game, the punishment will be drastically larger. Players will be pushed all the way back to the North Castle, which was the start of the game. And on top of that, as I mentioned in the leveling section, players will also lose all of their acquired experience, with that experience being set back to 0. And if you're playing the Famicom Disk System version of the game, that also results in all acquired level upgrades being set back to whatever the lowest level you have. So, game over in an action scene in the middle of the overworld, and you're set back here. Game over in the middle of a dungeon, and you're set back here. Game over from a boss fight, and you're set back here. This isn't a big issue at first, because Parapa Palace is still relatively close to the North Castle. So yes, you'll suffer a minor time sink and setback, but it shouldn't take too long to get back to where you were. But game over in Midoro Palace, and that means you'll have to once again go through the caves south of Rauru Town, once again trudge through the marsh, and once again make back all of the progress you lost in Midoro Palace when you died. and this setback only gets larger throughout most of the game as the map expands. There is one caveat to that, which is once players find the hammer, they'll be able to create a shortcut to the Island Palace and all future palaces by skipping the cave and marsh near Midoro Palace. But after acquiring the raft and heading to the east of Hyrule, that's something players will have to do every time they die on the eastern continent. There are other minor shortcuts that players can eventually find, but nothing so major that it takes away from just how inconvenient getting a game over continues to compound as players progress further and further through the game. I don't actually mind a lives game over and continue system like this on the surface. I think it's an okay system to have a minor setback for dying and then a larger punishment for receiving a game over. It's something that adds a lot of tension to the action of the game and drastically raises the stakes. But I do think that this game over system goes too far in being overly punishing. Primarily in once players reach the eastern continent, they'll still be set back all the way back to the North Castle in the western continent. From the eastern continent, there are still 4 temples players need to reach, and 3 of those temples where getting a game over will set players all the way back to the North Castle. One of the temples is simple enough to reach once players have the correct tool, where they can walk on water. One requires a tedious trek through a cave and then a maze with multiple required action scenes. This can be avoided once players find the treasure within the Maze Palace, but if players die before that, that is a lot of game you're forced to replay for making a mistake. The final normal dungeon of the Hidden Palace can only be reached after players progress through 3 forced action scenes and either a dangerous bridge or a trek through a giant forest where they're pretty much guaranteed to get into multiple random encounters. Now, everyone is going to be different in terms of what punishment they find acceptable, what becomes intense but still enjoyable, and what is a step too far. For me, this punishment grows to a point where I find it overly tedious rather than an interesting and fun challenge. It actively made me less interested in taking any risks, which maybe was a good thing, but something I found to be less enjoyable, as I like taking stupid risks every now and then. And I don't even hate the overall idea of how you're punished. I grew up with NES games, so I'm fairly used to devastating game over and live systems, and I do think it's fun to learn challenges and be required to master them. As far as losing your experience points go, that feels like a fitting punishment to me, and I don't have any notes on it. With the runback, the first continent, as an example, I think is handled really well in a bubble. The first dungeon isn't too hard to make it to, or that difficult in general. So while backtracking can be frustrating, it shouldn't be too tedious. The second dungeon has a much larger punishment, but it's still not an absolutely massive runback. You'll probably end up learning and improving on how to fight the boomerang tossing enemies, as that's part of the runback, and overall, it'll probably make you better at the game, which is part of the point of some of these punishments. Then, the third dungeon has a shortcut to it thanks to a tool you find, which is a rewarding feeling. But it's once you go past the first continent that this all falls apart. Because at that point, it's not like a runback is getting you better at the game, like it is in the case of the runback for the second dungeon. You're just trekking along a path, wasting your time. Then, it's even worse for some of the runbacks, like the Hidden Palace, because the required action sequences also don't make you feel like you're getting better at the game, because it's attempting to avoid these enemies tossing rocks down at you randomly, and probably bouncing off of the enemies just to run through. I actually think there are a couple simple solutions that would have worked for me and kept the idea and challenge intact. The easiest of these changes would be to have a checkpoint on the eastern continent. So if you die on the western continent, you return to the North Castle as per usual. But if you die on the eastern continent, you return to some checkpoint there, and let's say for the sake of argument, that's the first town you find on the eastern continent, the town of Naburu. Right there, you still have a runback for getting a game over, and it's probably similarly punishing in the late game as the start of the game, whereas how it currently stands, the punishment for a runback in the late game is far larger than the start of the game, as the game is only getting harder and harder anyways. Or you have shrines in the overworld players can find that they reach and activate as checkpoints. The team could then scatter these checkpoints to places that feel fair, but still have any level of challenge they intend using this placement. But it at least somewhat softens the impact and backtracking of getting a game over. My other suggestion has to do with link dolls players can find, which I'll touch on shortly. The punishment ideas in this system are fine: lose a little progress for losing a life, and then lose major progress and your acquired experience for a game over. But the real issue comes in that, as the game goes on and gets larger, the punishment for getting a game over also grows larger. But at the same time, the game only gets more and more challenging as the game progresses, as most games do, and that doesn't particularly play well with the fact that your punishment is also growing in size. You can certainly argue this is like most games of the era. In my head right now, I'm thinking of Contra. As the game goes on, it gets more challenging, and if you get a game over, that means you're starting back at the beginning, meaning your punishment for losing is greater further into the game. But these are also short action games, and Zelda 2 feels a little different. These are runbacks you're doing in the middle of the game, and again, when it's just walking around the overworld, it's not like you're even improving at the game by doing so. But where do you land on the lives and game over system of Zelda 2? Because I think it's a mix of the completely different gameplay system of Zelda 2 and this lives and game over system that has made the game so divisive. So, as I mentioned, I do have one more idea on what could have improved the lives and game over system, and that's in these link dolls players can find. Players can find these dolls, typically by walking on the correct tile in the overworld, although there are also a couple scattered hidden in dungeons. If Link obtains one of these dolls, it will give players a 1-up. However, and this is very notable, these dolls are one-time use. So find a doll and get a game over, and that doll will still be counted as used, and players will never be able to obtain it again in their current game. Unless you're a player who really knows what they're doing and is playing the game on a repeat playthrough, I think this is an incredibly dumb reward. It might extend one of your sessions before a game over slightly, but for the most part, it's going to be gone and have just barely helped you out. I honestly think it should have given you a permanent 1-up and been extra hidden. This would have made for a fantastic reward and actually really helped balance out the lives/game over system, plus given players more reason to explore. As it stands, there are 6 of these dolls to find. So yes, that would have been overkill in terms of giving players too many lives. But imagine if there were only 1, 2, or 3 of these, and just how rewarding that would have been to find a permanent increase in lives compared to a one-time use extra life. Even if you don't like that idea, I still think these dolls should have then, at the very least, respawned with every game over. That way, players could choose to spend extra time collecting the dolls that they need, but it would be their choice to do that time sink, and therefore prepare for some major upcoming challenge. As it stands, on subsequent playthroughs, I definitely grab them as I now know where they are, but after getting my first one and replaying Zelda 2 and immediately discovering they were a one-time use sort of thing, it completely took away from me thinking about searching for these, and like it wasn't worth the time or effort. After that long asides, let's come back to Midoro Dungeon, as we've now made it to the boss, Helmethead, or Jermafenser. Helmethead is similar to Horsehead in that players will need to jump and attack his head in order to actually damage him. He is a leveled up version of Horsehead though. Helmethead will shoot projectiles out of his helmet the player can block with their shield, but still need to be wary of. If that weren't enough, for attacking his head and weak point, you'll knock off his helmet and he'll grow a new helmet. The old helmet will then fly along the sky still shooting projectiles while his new helmet also does so. Knock off the second helmet and his actual head will come out. But you'll now have to deal with 2 floating helmets in the air shooting projectiles as well as his head shooting projectiles. Outside of the fact that this visual of him growing new heads is pretty hilarious, this is a major step up in difficulty as players will now have to deal with so many projectiles at once. I actually find this to be overkill, and it didn't feel like there was a good proper strategy for beating Helmethead without taking damage. So it felt like the best way to defeat Helmethead is by trying to rush and get as many hits as you can on him after casting the shield spell for defense, as sort of a war of attrition, which I don't personally find to be a great design. If there were 1 less helmet and just 1 floating around, I think this would have been a good battle that rewards patience and properly blocking fireballs with your shield as you get hits in when you can, but it isn't. Something I do want to note is that the version NES players saw of Helmethead was actually slightly different than the version Japanese players saw on the Famicom Disk System. The Famicom Disk System version, Midoro Palace, only has one helmet, per what I felt like was a proper step up. The version with two helmets does exist, but only appears in the later Ocean Palace as a more advanced version. In the NES version, that boss is replaced by Gooma, which I'd guess was to have less repetition in boss fights. So the NES version actually sees a harder version of this boss in Midoro Palace. And perhaps because the team cut one version of the fight, they decided to leave in the more advanced version as it was the more interesting fight. Now, I was curious and looked to see if there were strategies I wasn't thinking of online. The two main strategies I found were, level up your strength so high that you can quickly beat Helmethead with ease, but that doesn't really solve the flaw I found in the battle. The other strategy was to instead first travel to Mido, where you can obtain the downward strike and use that. That's a fine idea, and you could argue it rewards players for exploring, but I honestly still think this fight has one fire projectile too many. So, speaking on that downward thrust, after defeating Helmethead and restoring the crystal to Midoro Palace, it's time to head to Mido Town, and then eventually the Island Palace. The first part of this will require players to head into Death Mountain in order to find the hammer. But there's a problem. The only way to reach Death Mountain is through Saria, but the guard there won't raise a bridge to let players through. Don't you know that I'm trying to hook up with an ancient corpse and be king? The solution here is through a clue. There's a bot in one of the houses. Talk to that bot once, and the dialogue will show that it's sleeping. Talk to it a second time, and you'll get the same dialogue. But talk to it a third time, and it will still have the same dialogue. Talk to it 4 times, and you'll get the clue. Let me be, Master is in the woods end of river. With that clue, you'll know you should head to the forest north of the river, and one of the random tiles there will reveal a house with Bagu in it. Although, step on the wrong forest tile, and you'll go into a forced minor action sequence. Find Bagu, and he'll tell you, Bagu is my name, show my note to Riverman. Which is pretty clear, and if you do so, you'll be able to proceed past the bridge and onto Death Mountain. I think there are some issues with this sequence and the way the clues work. Generally speaking, gaining information from villagers and clues is a system I think works well for Zelda 2 and gives a nice purpose to the towns beyond simply being heal stations. But my issue with this sequence, specifically, is that with the way dialogue functions in Zelda 2, the text slowly appears in typewriter fashion, meaning that you won't see the actual dialogue immediately, meaning that waiting for it is something players aren't necessarily likely to do if they think the information they're about to receive is irrelevant. I honestly don't remember everything from last time I played Zelda 2 prior to making this video, or when I played as a kid, and I didn't remember this hut, nor did I remember the bot clue. So I talked to the bot twice, received Z's twice in a row, and figured there was no additional information. Ironically, I actually talked to the bot a third time, but didn't let the text appear, so I never received that vital clue. That was my first time in Saria Town before completing Midoro Palace. My second time back after completing the palace, I thought maybe there was something unique about this bot and a potential clue I was missing. So again, I talked to it twice and only received Z's. Then I tried attacking the bot and using spells, but nothing worked. So I left again, never receiving the clue, wondering if perhaps a later spell would reveal what the purpose of the bot was, or if maybe it was just meant to be a fun Easter egg that a monster lived in town. I can't guarantee this is everyone's experience, but I'm certain it will be some people's experience, because receiving the same dialogue 3 times in a row is usually akin to saying, "There's nothing more here." And because the dialogue text appears so slowly, it de-incentivizes you from repeatedly talking to the same NPC over and over again to see if there's some secret additional dialogue. So while I think it's okay to have this sort of thing in general, this was an incredibly important clue, and at the very least, the game should have indicated with the second dialogue box that there would be something more with a slightly different bit of dialogue from the first. This also leads to another interesting note about Zelda 2, and that's in the way its overworld exploration works for secrets. To try to create a little more intrigue to the overworld, there are several tiles players can step on that will lead to special action sequences. These include fairly obvious tiles players will step on, like a little forest in the first sequence of the game that leads to a pea bag, or it could be tiles that completely hide action sequences, like in the case of the forest that houses the, house of Bagu, or as I mentioned in the Link Doll section, there are tiles with no indicator on them that they house a secret that will just happen to have something like a Link Doll, or potentially a health upgrade or a magic upgrade. So, these hidden overworld encounters are both used for secrets meant to entice exploration, as well as give NPCs and hints a purpose, or sometimes to try and create more unique and interesting progression. So, with the hint system, later on, you'll get a clue to talk to Rauru from Rauru Town, who in turn will tell you how to find a secret grave tile, which is the way to reach the island palace. Rauru, by the way, saying "I am Rauru" isn't a bug. That was actually what his name was programmed to be as a joke, but the joke doesn't really work as well in English as it simply sounds like a mistake. Anyways, for heading to something like the Maze Palace or south of the Eastern Continent, players will encounter hidden forced action sequences that were meant to make the paths more interesting. In a nutshell though, this part of the exploration is stepping on the correct tile that just happens to have a hidden action scene in it. While some of these are obvious, most of them have zero indicator, really resulting in a game where you walk on every tile just hoping one of them is a secret. That's far less interesting than something like Zelda 1, where you're visually seeing a clue of something you should have explored later with the correct tool, and therefore feel like you're solving a puzzle. Instead, this is just blind luck. And I wouldn't even mind that so much, as it's a bit like burning down every tree in Zelda 1 hoping for a secret, except for the fact that all of this is in an area where you'll constantly be dealing with random encounters, making exploring feel more tedious than fun, at least to me. I think there's an argument to be had that things like talking to an NPC multiple times only to finally receive a clue, and these hidden tiles create a nice level of mystery and intrigue to Zelda 2. Without the internet, when the games came out, they were the sorts of things players would excitedly share with each other once they discovered them. So I get that, and I am all for that sort of thing. I think if the bot hadn't housed such a vital clue, or the text scroll wasn't so slow, or its clue led to something like a health upgrade, it wouldn't have bothered me. And my main issue with exploring every tile of the overworld is primarily in the random encounters making that process a lot less fun. I do want to note that, at the very least, just about every major upgrade you'll need is hinted at by an NPC in some way, so players won't necessarily need to step on every single tile on the entire map unless you're looking for Link Dolls. So that was a way to make NPC clues and exploration related to those clues more meaningful. So on that overworld exploration, it's time to explore Death Mountain, where players will need to go through a maze of action sequences in order to eventually work your way out and find the hammer. If you've beaten Midoro Palace, I don't think anything here is too wildly challenging, and I actually think this is a nice maze that can get a little confusing, but in a way that should have players actually trying to track which entrances lead to which exit in a fun way. Because there are multiple routes with different exits, and backtracking is only loosely sometimes required, I actually think this sort of maze system works much better than how the mazes of the palaces sometimes work. The hammer itself is a fantastic reward that will let players break rocks in the overworld, and trees, which is something I didn't know. Breaking the rocks opens the way to more upgrades, and perhaps most importantly, shortcuts. It's a great feeling to finally be able to break a rock south of the North Castle that will help players quickly reach both Midoro Palace and the Island Palace. It's the type of shortcut tool I honestly wish there were a few more of in the game. In a fun Easter egg, I've seen people say online that the bottom portion of the map below Death Mountain is supposed to represent the entire map of Zelda 1. And looking at it from a bird's eye view, that does seem to be the case. I'm not 100% certain, but it seems like a fun Easter egg. Using the hammer, players can also find the Water of Life, which is a fetch quest item for a required spell found in the harbor town of Mido. Something nice about this though, and the fetch quests in general, is that Link doesn't need to obtain the quest before he can find the required item. That makes this feel less tedious and helps with the pacing of the game. Mido also houses another secret. players will receive a clue, no one is here, but a church bell will ring. Go to the church in town, and there's a clearly open door on the second floor. So if you're clever, cast the jump spell, and you can jump up to enter into the second floor, which will lead to an attack upgrade. This is another step up in making the towns require a little more exploration, and while I had issues with some of the mechanics around how talking to certain NPCs multiple times work, this one is a fun bit of exploration, and is something I wish we'd seen more in the towns. Speaking of that secret, for talking to the knight in the church, players will learn the down thrust attack. This is the attack that I feel like Zelda 2 is most known for. Jump in the air and press down, and players will thrust their sword downwards. If they hit an enemy, they'll bounce off of the enemy, creating a minor bounce mechanic. The hitbox for this seems to actually be fairly large, allowing players to not necessarily be over the enemy for it to count as a hit, which is something I'm sure the team decided on to be a little more forgiving to players, especially considering Link can't jump particularly high. This is an incredibly fun move, as bouncing is fun to do, and it has been cited as an inspiration in a giant plethora of games, including Shovel Knight. Although I honestly think DuckTales was the true inspiration, as the pogo mechanics are nearly identical. The pogo mechanic of Zelda 2, though, isn't much of a pogo. Players will bounce off of enemies and be able to continually do so if they're holding down, which can be a lot of fun, but the bounce doesn't give Link very much height. So it's not something that's really used for exploration, or even bouncing from one enemy to another, and is specifically tied to combat in that way. This is another tool for quickly defeating enemies who are low to the ground, and for some enemies, this will be their weak point. Additionally, if players are in a tough combat encounter, they can instead pogo over enemies to run away and escape, or use this to pogo to the other side if the side they're fighting from is dangerous in any way. So it plays properly into the physics and combat system of Zelda 2. Link still feels heavy, and the pogo doesn't bounce him high, but it does open up a few new opportunities within combat. I do think various games that have been inspired by Zelda 2 took that concept and ran with it in fantastic ways that are incredibly fun. But while I love the pogo mechanics of the other games that have larger pogos, I do think this more grounded pogo was what mechanically made the most sense for Zelda 2, and is a fantastic additional feature to the game. After obtaining the fairy spell and downward thrust, it's time to head into the Island Palace through a secret route in the giant graveyard. The Island Palace is much more straightforward than Midoro Palace, with the start of the stage simply seeing Link travel from left to right through multiple challenge sequences as it introduces a few new enemies. There aren't really any points here where players will get trapped into long and forced backtracking, and all of the keys work in ways that will naturally lead players to either the raft key item or to the boss of Rebonack. If I'm counting properly, Parapa Palace had 3 Iron Knuckles, Midoro Palace tripled that with 9 Iron Knuckles, and the Island Palace has a whopping 11 Iron Knuckles. On top of that, only orange Iron Knuckles were in Parapa Palace. The slightly upgraded red Iron Knuckles could be found in Midoro Palace, who have better defense. The Island Palace introduces the most advanced version in blue Iron Knuckles, who also shoot out sword beams when they attack, and they attack far faster than the other Iron Knuckles. So, in a way, this is the Iron Knuckle Palace, and players will be constantly facing these and should be really learning, by now, how to properly deal with them. There is an easy method for quickly defeating these, by jumping and attacking their heads, but I'm not sure how many players will figure that out their first time through the game. I certainly didn't, which is why you see me doing this in later playthroughs I recorded, but not my first. Either way, players should be learning how to properly read and guard against their sword attacks with their shield while regularly counterattacking. This is important as it's training players for many future fights, but also, specifically, the boss of the Island Palace. Reach the end of the Island Palace, and players will duke it out against Rebonack. Rebonack is a blue Iron Knuckle on a horse. It's a fun idea where players are asked to time out and properly attack with the down thrust in order to remove Rebonack from his horse. This will then result in a normal blue knuckle fight, meaning all of your training against the Iron Knuckles of the Island Palace were to build up your skill for the boss of this palace. It is a little disappointing that it is just another blue knuckle, but I do like that consistency with how the enemies of the dungeon were tied directly to the boss fight. I was curious and did some experimenting to see if you can defeat Rebonack without the downstrike. After all, what if a player didn't discover and find the downstrike attack in Mido? Well, attacking the horse deflects Link's attack. However, players can attack Rebonack while he's on his horse from behind, where he'll still be weak. It's difficult to do as he turns to face the player, but you can cast the jump spell to make this a little easier to get on the opposite side. So I actually think that's a nice inclusion. While it's not the recommended way to do this, it's nice to have alternate ways to fight him, and even a way for players who haven't discovered every attack. Although, that is probably just a quirk of how the fight works, and I'm not sure if it was intentional. It's likely there's a defense hitbox on the horse portion of Rebonack, while the knight portion has a hitbox players can strike. So, they simply didn't draw an additional defense hitbox on Rebonack's back to make it easier for players to actually hurt him with the downstrike. Overall, while it's a bit of a shame to fight a blue knuckle as a boss fight, the combination with the jousting knight start of the fight that then turns into a blue knuckle when he's essentially dismounted is a fun idea, and it's nice to see a timing challenge come into play with Link's down thrust. After completing the island palace and obtaining its raft, it's time to head to the eastern continent. While at first this will seem like a new open area to explore, really, the only places players can actually head to for now are into the town of Naburu, and north through a cave and towards the Maze Palace further east, or the mountain town of Darunia further west. Players will learn the fire spell in Naburu, the reflect spell in Darunia, and can find another knight in Darunia who will teach players the upwards thrust attack. For this attack, hold up while jumping, and players will attack right above them, similar to the downward thrust attack in that way. It's worth noting that several enemies on this island are impervious to Link's normal attacks, which takes us back to a clue from the very first town: when in doubt, use fire. So I actually think that it's nice that a hint from the start of the game comes into play this much later. Speaking on the various clues, you should be able to get just about everything you need here. Finding the knight is interesting in that you'll need to not only jump onto the roof of a house like before, but go down the chimney. That one requires a special command, and funny enough, I was able to completely avoid needing this by accidentally breaking the game, but more on that later. To get to Maze Palace, players will need to travel to the northeast corner of the map to a maze island. Various unmarked tiles on the island result in either required action sequences, or the way to find both a magic container and rescue a child for the reflect spell. I think this is a good usage of the invisible tile encounter concept in Zelda 2, as it does create a unique traversal sequence that really only works thanks to the way this mechanic functions. The Maze Palace itself is filled with brand new spellcasting wizards. Players can't defeat them unless they cast Reflect, in which case they'll be able to reflect the spells right back at the wizards. The dungeon is set up in a way that I think really leads players to finding its key item of the boots, which allows Link to walk on water in the overworld and, notably, creates a nice shortcut back to the Maze Palace if players get a game over or leave. If players travel to the left, they'll immediately be greeted by a locked door, so will end up traveling to the right. This will lead to an elevator down or a path to the right. Ignoring the elevator down, if players head even further right, they'll find a walkway with crumbling ground and a long jump. Players can make this jump without the jump spell, although they're unlikely to, which will lead them to dropping into the pit below. If players do make the jump, they'll eventually find a key, but still have to backtrack and be forced to drop into the pit anyways. In a twist, this doesn't kill players, but instead drops them into the section right below. Players can drop again as the ground below them will once again crumble, but even if they do, it will probably create enough intrigue as to what's on this floor you have to drop to. Drop even further and you'll find a true death pit underneath in a lava pit, which is nicely visually communicated. If there's nothing below, Link can drop. Otherwise, if there's something like fire or water, as we've learned before, that will kill Link. From dropping, you'll discover the true purpose of the elevator we found below was really as a way to bring players back up from here. So with that level of intrigue, players will likely be led into exploring the section that requires the drop, which will lead to the boots. Exploring the right side of the screen fully will lead to an extra key and how players can then finally progress to the left near the start of the dungeon. I like this layout for a number of reasons. For one, it's a much more interesting idea with the surprise drop and that intrigue of what's in the drop portion. But for 2, if players collect a key here and die, or leave the dungeon for whatever reason, like say they don't have the upwards attack, which I didn't have, once they return, they don't have to complete any of this section again and can simply head to the left, which is what will lead to the boss of the dungeon. And speaking of that, head to the left and players will find another locked door with an incredibly obvious key above them. The tiles are ones players should know by now they can destroy, and the only way to do this is with the up attack found in Darunia. However, I hadn't found this attack by this point, as I hadn't visited the village yet, so that's where it's nice that you can simply leave, but still have made progress in the dungeon. Better yet, the key item of the boots will allow traversal back and forth to be far faster, meaning if you do find that before leaving, you'll still feel like you made a successful dungeon run. Generally speaking, I think this is a great dungeon, but there is one more thing I found here. Because I hadn't found the upwards attack, I started desperately experimenting. And on that, I decided to turn into a fairy to see if I could somehow fly up into the blocks to destroy them. That didn't work, but it turns out there's a likely glitch in that you can travel through doors when you're in fairy form without having a key. So I actually ended up completing this dungeon before I found the upward strike. And I do have to wonder, was this a glitch or was it an intended Easter egg? I'm leaning towards that it was a glitch, and something about the fairy's hitbox was too small to properly interact with the locked door hitbox, which is what allows players to slip and be pushed through. But it seems to me like this wouldn't be the hardest collision to detect and simply block players acting like a wall. Although maybe that's just a quirk for how the collision detection works throughout all of Zelda 2, and this is simply the most noticeable bug as a result of that. Before moving on to the boss of Maze Palace, it's time to move on to the subjective topics of art and music. Let's start with the art of Zelda 2. I couldn't find any direct quotes about creating the art for Zelda 2, but I do think Link's side-scrolling sprite looks really nice on a subjective level. Notably, all of his colors from his outline are brown instead of black. I'm guessing this was to help further separate Link from the backgrounds, as the dungeons frequently use black in their background tile work, so brown pops far better. While I like Link's sprite work and the enemy sprite work for Zelda 2, I honestly think the NPCs and towns feel a little generic. Another element worth noting is something I actually brought up in my Zelda 1 video, and that's the coloring of the UI for Zelda 2. The UI HUD bar is far smaller than Zelda 1's HUD, as there's no longer a need for a map, and all of the information a player could want is nicely condensed into far less space. But another nice trick the team does to help blend the HUD into stages was by changing the background color dependent on the scene players are in. If players are outside, the HUD takes on a blue shade to match the background color of the actual background in order to disguise that it's actually a separate element. When players are in a dungeon, the background of the HUD is black. This makes the bar a little more obvious, but because the tiles end before the bar starts, it actually helps make it feel like the dungeon rooms simply don't reach that high. It's something Nintendo actually did for Mario 1 as well, so it's a nice continuation of the same visual trick. One more thing I want to note is that for some reason, the collision detection of all of the sprites on the screen is slightly off in terms of where they detect the ground. If you notice, Link's feet and the enemy's feet both slightly bleed into the ground, rather than properly standing directly on top. It's been a very long time since I've played Zelda 2 on a CRT TV, so I'm not sure if this was less apparent, or even remotely obvious on one of those TVs, as the pixels wouldn't be as crisp and bleed into each other a little more. So perhaps when the game was initially made, this was less of an issue. It's not a huge deal, but it is noticeable, so it does make me wonder why the ground's detection wasn't slightly higher up, or the sprite's ground colliders weren't slightly higher up in order to prevent this from happening. Zelda 2 saw a mostly completely different team from Zelda 1, and the music was no exception. While Koji Kondo wrote the music for Zelda 1, Zelda 2's music was written by Akito Nakatsuka. Koji Kondo's score for Zelda 1 is absolutely iconic, primarily thanks to the incredibly fun and catchy overworld theme. But Akito Nakatsuka also delivered some fantastic tracks. As I already mentioned, I happen to really enjoy the intro track. On top of that, I think both the Overworld track and Palace theme are well done, with the Palace theme becoming another iconic Zelda track, probably thanks in part to Super Smash Bros. I personally think the NES version of the soundtrack is much stronger, in particular thanks to the battle theme you'll hear during every random encounter. Honestly, I find the original battle theme from the Famicom Disk System version to be a little ear-grating, whereas the reworked version of the battle theme for the NES has a great sense of danger to it, but is still catchy and pleasant to listen to. But that is another notable element to the music and sound of Zelda 2. Because it was originally made for the Famicom Disk System, like Zelda 1, all of the music had to be reworked for the NES. But in this case, some of the tracks and sound effects were notably changed, I think for the better. After exploring the Maze Temple, players will come to the boss, Carock. Carock is a giant wizard and has pretty much the exact same moveset, defenses, and weakness. He'll teleport around the room and cast a magical projectile at Link. Link can't hurt Carock normally, but with the Reflect spell, can bounce the projectile right back at Carock. On the surface, that's a good idea. Have a boss players will need to dodge, and then use their shield to reflect projectiles back at them. But in practice, what this really results in is players simply needing to stand to the side of the screen and crouch, and then just let the shield do all of the work. This will see Carock rarely teleport into Link, with attacks just automatically decimating Carock. It's funny, because I feel like there was a pretty easy solution to making this fight not a joke that we'd already seen in the Blue Dark Nuts. Simply have projectiles attack on the upper or bottom plane, making players need to at least somewhat react to properly counter and defeat the boss. But that's not the case here. So for some, this might be a bit of a relief type of boss if you're struggling with the game, as it's so simple. But I do feel like it's a little too simple. With the boots on hand and the Maze Palace complete, it's now time to journey to the Ocean Palace. This one is obvious, as the path to the palace is nicely clued to players simply with a path that leads into the ocean. While this is pretty obvious, it is a nice way to create a sense of exploration and discovery for players without needing any specific dialogue. The Ocean Palace is, in some ways, the most maze-like of the dungeons so far, as there are several dead ends after longer paths with absolutely nothing in them. Some of these serve no purpose other than probably to confuse players and make the dungeon more difficult, whereas one of these dead ends is through what's probably the most challenging portion of the stage, but will provide players with a vital clue. Players will be able to see a key beyond a wall that they can't go past. This takes us back to a clue from Darunia. The palace has a false wall. So hopefully between these two clues, players will piece together that there's a false wall that will lead to this key. Now, taking a look at the map of the dungeon, the key is to the right side of a room in the middle. In the hallway above, which players will have access to get here, there's a path that goes further right in the direction of that key, but if you go all the way, you'll come to a dead end. The elevator above, similarly, has a dead end to the right. So, following that same logic that we have to go to the right somehow to get the missing key, let's return to the left of where players will have seen that key. This will take you to an elevator where you can choose to go down. The bottom floor also takes players to a dead end. And the floor in between takes players to around where the key would have been, but to another dead end. But we know there's a false wall in one of the palaces, and it wasn't in any of the previous palaces. And we know there's a key we can somehow get to that's just above where the player is. So jump along the wall here, and you'll find the false wall, which will lead to both that key as well as the flute. A couple more interesting notes on this. Players can actually reach and defeat Gooma without ever finding the flute. But if you beat the boss of a palace and haven't found the key item, you'll still be able to access it until you've found both the key item and defeated the boss, which will then make the palace inaccessible. Finally, the one way to proceed to the final two dungeons is with the flute, which players find behind the false wall. So if players have finished every palace except for the Ocean Palace, none of those have false walls, which means that the clue we received in Darunia, the palace has a false wall, has to apply to the Ocean Palace. There's no other place players would be able to experiment with that clue. So I think this is a fantastic sequence of feeding players the idea of a false wall back in Darunia, and then using that key that's just within sight to clue players in to what direction they should be searching for the false wall. Being the gamer that I am, I actually found the false wall before going to Darunia and before receiving the clue, which to me shows just how well that key placement intuitively should lead players to discovering the false wall. But I play a lot of games, and I just finished replaying Zelda 1, which also had false walls, so it was on my mind. So to that end, I'm glad the clue in Darunia exists, and I think between the two, players should be able to piece together where to go. The combat challenges in the Ocean Palace aren't too difficult, especially thanks to the fact you can bounce over some of them if you choose with the down thrust attack. So I think that also helps with exploring for this false wall. And all in all, I really enjoyed the Ocean Palace and its more interesting puzzle. Things like this false wall and the dropping sequence from the Maze Palace really help elevate these palaces for me, as I like the introduction of these more interesting exploration concepts. For reaching the end of the Ocean Palace, in the NES version of Zelda 2, this will lead players to the boss Gooma. Gooma is a pretty simple fight. He'll swing a ball and chain at Link and then retract it. And that's it. The catch is that the ball and chain deals massive damage. So the strategy becomes pretty simple. Lure Gooma into attacking, and then attack Gooma immediately after his attack during his recovery phase. While I'm glad this fight isn't a more complex version of Helmethead, like it was in the original Famicom Disk System release, and is something unique, it highlights to me the team seeming to run out of interesting ideas for unique boss fights that play into Link's battle mechanics. The fight is fine, but I think overall a little uninteresting, and it doesn't feel that much different than the Horsehead fight, except for that Gooma attacks for more damage, and players can injure him anywhere. This is just me spitballing and throwing a quick example, but there's no fight where Link has to deflect an attack with his shield or a series of attacks that then creates an opening for him to strike. And for a game which usually has combat about properly defending, these boss fights often don't fall into that same gameplay. Now, this could actually play a little into what Shigeru Miyamoto was expressing was a disappointment of his for Zelda 2, and that maybe they had giant boss concepts they simply couldn't do due to hardware restrictions. Or perhaps on the NES or Famicom Disk System, it was difficult to program combat behavior that was more complex, or took up more space than they really had to work with. So it is worth noting that the team was working under heavy restrictions, and I do want to cut them some slack. With Gooma and our 5th palace defeated, it's off to the Hidden Palace. For the Hidden Palace, players will need to head south with the flute to pass through a river demon, and then through a series of required action sequences. This will take you to the southeastern portion of the map, which is home to 2 different palaces as well as 2 different towns. On top of that, there's another wrinkle in that some enemies are completely invisible, at least for now, making graveyards and the path to the Great Palace in particular dangerous. I think this is a good example of what I consider to be a good way to gate progression in a way that feels natural and unobtrusive. Technically, players can head south past the graveyard, into the Valley of Death, and then proceed to the Great Palace. However, these invisible enemies can make this incredibly difficult to do. It's not impossible, so this exploration is still open to players, but it's very clear that players will probably need a tool to properly progress. So our other current option is to head into the town just south past a couple bridges. This turns out to be Kasuto, but there's nobody here and it's infested with invisible enemies. Fortunately, the very first building is open and leads to a wise man who will inform players, the town is dead, look east in woods. And this is where I got stuck. Because there is a very obvious area that would seem to house a secret village. There's a cave that leads to a dead end with a forest. So I thought, hey, if I walk on every tile, one of them is probably going to be a secret tile with a village, but that wasn't the case. So we turned to the manual. If you look up the information about the hammer, it can break rocks and cut down trees on the landscape map. This is the one single clue that I feel like should have appeared somewhere in the game, because your tool is a hammer, and it has a clear indicated use for breaking down rocks, which makes sense. Why would you think a hammer would somehow cut down trees? If there were an axe tool players could find, I don't think you'd need a hint, but at least to me, this wasn't at all intuitive. I think that can also be a problem with a majority of the required hints being in-game, with some being in a manual. Because Zelda 2 is so good about including all of the necessary information within the game, I didn't think I had to turn to the manual. And again, as a reminder, with the Famicom disc writer, Shigeru Miyamoto and team knew that many Japanese players wouldn't have a manual when they were designing Zelda 2. Beyond that, I actually like this secret. If you chop down the correct forest tile, you'll discover the hidden town of Kasuto, which is thriving. Not only is this a cool little puzzle, minus my issue with the hammer, but it also has a nice element of world building to it. As the hidden town of Kasuto is essentially the final village, although we will come back to Old Kasuto, there's a major secret here. If players obtain the spell, yes, that's what it's called, they can use it at the end of the village to obtain a skeleton key that can be used on every locked door in every dungeon to unlock them. While this is technically necessary in the Hidden Palace, unless you do the fairy glitch, it's not really as helpful as finding the key in Zelda 1, as you can do dungeons so out of order in Zelda 1, and the key isn't required, but is incredibly helpful in the final dungeon. I think it has a lot more usage. Whereas here, if you took doors and keys out of the Hidden Palace, it would essentially be the exact same thing as having this key you're supposed to obtain right before going to it. I suppose you could say that having all of the locked doors in the Hidden Palace, if players find that before Kasuto, which I actually did, means players shouldn't be able to progress and therefore are required to find Kasuto, which will matter for the end of the game, so that is worth pointing out. On top of multiple secrets, some of which we'll come back to, players will find an important clue, call for help at the 3-eye rocks. So head to the 3 rocks in a Triforce pattern, use your flute, and you'll discover the Hidden Palace. As you now should have a skeleton key, the Hidden Palace is simply about finding the correct route to its key item and correct route to the boss, without needing to worry about finding keys or backtracking if you missed the key. In order to make the dungeon more interesting, the team played a little further with the dropping concept. The first drop players will come to will take players down a looping set of drops. There's nothing difficult about this, as it's essentially a one-way elevator, but it is a fun change of pace. The second drop is paired with an elevator, and like the Maze Palace, asks players to exit between the drop and the landing point. But to do so, players will need to cast the fairy spell in mid-air as they're dropping. It's another minor puzzle, but again, I think this is a nice change of pace that makes the dungeon more interesting. Other than that, the dungeon is a fairly straightforward set of combat challenges, with the stage, for the most part, simply progressing from left to right, depending on which route players choose in the infinite loop drop. The top route will take players to the key item of the cross, which will allow players to see invisible enemies. The bottom route will take players to the boss. Additionally, there are a couple mini-boss fights here, with players needing to square off against Rebonack twice. Although, this time around, half of his health will be while he's mounted, and half of his health when he's dismounted, which actually ends up making him easier than a traditional blue knuckle, as it's so simple to deal damage to him without getting hurt while he's in his jousting mode. For the most part, I think the challenges here are pretty mild, but there are 3 that specifically stand out to me. The first one sees Link hopping over lava pits while also dealing with these Raws who spawn in and float across the screen in a sine wave pattern. These aren't new, but the danger of dealing with them near these lava pits players are required to jump over makes this sequence particularly difficult, as it's so easy to get knocked back into an instant death. While this one can feel a little unfair, this is the final normal dungeon, so it feels like a fitting challenge. The other sequence is a required fairy sequence, where Link will need to turn into a fairy and travel across a fire pit while avoiding both bubbles and these slime droppers. I wouldn't call it particularly challenging, but it is a change of pace from the standard combat, and I appreciate the team coming up with a unique challenge sequence for Link in fairy mode. Finally, there's a hidden drop players can fall through on the way to the cross. This caught me by surprise, and it tosses you into an optional lower portion. To get through this, because there's blocks to destroy afterwards, casting fairy actually won't work, and players will need to memorize where the drop was using the pillars in the background for reference. I love this little challenge, and that it made me actually think about the dungeon layout a little deeper. While this dungeon is a little more linear in some ways than the other ones, I actually think that helps make it a little more distinct. Make it through the hidden palace, and players will reach Barba. Barba is a fire dragon who will pop out of lava pits and spit fire down at Link. This boss fight takes place over a fire pit with a few safe platforms Link can stand on. So what that means is that certain platforms become somewhat unsafe while Barba is shooting down fire. While players can attack Barba normally, as his head bobs up and down just within Link's range, and he'll also pop in and out of lava, giving players a chance to strike. Really, it's ideal to cast the jump spell in order to consistently jump attack Barba. Because Barba shoots fireballs, the reflect spell will also help prevent the fireballs from hurting Link if the fire hits the shield and not Link's body. Really though, probably the biggest danger of the fight is getting knocked back into the lava pit, which will cause an instant death. This fight is a fun concept, but it's also very simple. For some reason, jumping up and attacking Barba's head repeatedly seems to typically put Link out of range of the fire attack. That means players can mostly turn off their brains and do this simple sequence. I do wonder if, perhaps, Barba causing flames to spread across the entire platform he attacks, similar to the Rebonack fights in the Sonic games, might have made for a more interesting fight of players needing to go for attacks when they can, then retreat to the safe platform. Either way, this fight is a nice change of pace. It's nice to see a large monster like this who creates a different sort of battle than we'd seen before. With Barba defeated, the final crystal in place, and the cross in hand, it's time to head to the final dungeon, the Great Palace. But you might just want to max out your levels, heart containers, and magic containers before doing so. This is partially required. You see, in order to get the spell from the hidden town of Kasuto, players will need to have a total of 7 magic bars, meaning they've found 3 magic containers. Not only that, but players will also be allowed into a special building where they'll find the final magic container. And from there, and this is a major thing I missed, players will need to head back to Old Kasuto and the wise man who informed Link of the hidden town of Kasuto. If you have 8 total magic bars, he will teach players the final spell, Thunder, and this spell is required for finishing the game, which is something I wish I knew, because I didn't find that spell and went to the Great Palace where I reached Thunderbird and realized after not being able to injure him that I was probably missing something. That's where, once again, the manual can come in handy. As I mentioned way back at the start of the video, the manual provides a couple hints, and one of these is in listing all of the spells players can find. Simply knowing that Thunder exists could trigger players to re-explore before heading to the final dungeon, or even realize, wait a second, every spell so far has been found in a town, so the final spell might just be in the one town where you haven't found a spell yet. The only real problem I have with this is there's no in-game way to know that the requirement is the full 8 magic bars. At least as far as I'm aware, he'll either give you the hint about the hidden town of Kasuto, or he'll give you the Thunder spell once you have all of the magic containers. The wise man from the hidden town of Kasuto says, "Come back when you are ready," indicating there's something more to be found. So that at least indicates he's here to give you magic as per usual, and there's some requirement you need to meet. That's not the case with the wise man who gives you Thunder. But once players have Thunder, it's time for the gauntlet of the Valley of Death, which is aptly named. If you don't have the cross, you can basically guarantee the random encounters that hold invisible enemies and fire pits will lead to instant deaths. And if you do, the only real surefire way I found to be safe here was to use Spell and turn these enemies into bots. On top of that, there are a series of required action sequences that will see players fighting off against both these Moas and Gerus while dealing with lava pits. Some of this actually isn't that difficult if players are patient and properly wait for the Moas to deal with them before crossing any of the fire pits. But that does make this section particularly tedious to go through. It's the final gauntlet, so I get it, and fortunately, unlike the rest of the game, once players reach the Great Palace, they'll get a new Game Over Continue checkpoint. So while yes, this section of the game can be painful to go through, so long as you come properly prepared with Thunder, you won't have to do this portion again. That said, this section suffers from repetition. There are 3 mandatory hidden encounter sequences players will need to finish in order to progress. but all three of them are nearly identical, and they all require patience as they all require players to wait to properly defeat Moas before proceeding over lava pits. There are also 2 mandatory cave sequences, and while these are somewhat different from each other, they both contain a large cave room with a similar layout, just with different enemies inside. So the idea of a final gauntlet of challenges here is a good one and makes sense, but I do think the combination of waiting around for Moas and these 3 hidden encounter sections that are, for all intents and purposes, the exact same, takes away from this and creates a sequence that feels more tedious than like a true test. If players make it through the gauntlet of the Valley of Death and have placed all 6 crystals, they'll be able to enter the Great Palace. As players have a skeleton key, and there's no key item to find here, the Great Palace is really a giant maze with difficult enemies and encounters players will need to travel through in order to discover the final boss. The Great Palace is absolutely enormous, so between that and that players had to travel to the Valley of Death to even reach the Great Palace, fortunately, this was the one spot where the team decided that dying and using a continue would place players back at the start of the Great Palace instead of all the way back at the North Castle, alleviating a huge amount of frustration. This means that even if you die multiple times on your journey to the Great Palace, you can still have a fresh start exploring its depths. Given its size, I think that was a necessary concession, and it makes exploring the Great Palace much more fun. With that, this quickly becomes a maze for players to either route out in their brains or on paper, and if you're fully leveled up, you can attempt to skillfully avoid enemy encounters thanks to the downward thrust bounce mechanic, making the entire palace more accessible for exploring and multiple run-throughs. Probably the nastiest trick that this dungeon pulls is having false ground players can fall through, with one of these required for players to reach the end of the dungeon. The one required for heading to the final bosses is covered by a random grouping of blocks Link can destroy using the Handy Gloves passive ability, which destroys these. As they're so random in their placement, they automatically feel suspicious, and I think this actually works well to indicate something is off, and maybe you should destroy these blocks. Additionally, the path is a dead end otherwise, and the spacing is uncomfortably small for its enemies, so the way I found this was simply by trying to create a larger room for myself to deal with the enemies. So the way the room is laid out is in a way that encourages players to destroy these blocks for one reason or another. Beyond simply being a giant maze, the Great Palace also presents the most challenging enemies seen in the game. This includes these turkeys, or Foca, which are essentially upgraded iron knuckles, a giant bot that explodes into normal bots, an enormous bubble, and these fire-tossing Fokeru, who are essentially upgraded Goomas. While nothing here is brand new in terms of gameplay functionality, it's still a nice culmination of every major challenge we've seen, culminating in a dungeon that's a true final test, but still allows players to speed through once they know the proper route. For making it to the end of the Great Palace, players will have to duke it out against the penultimate boss, the Thunderbird. As I mentioned earlier, Thunderbird is impervious to damage until players cast Thunder, which, even at magic level 8, will wipe out half of your MP bar. Regardless of if players have cast Thunder or not, the Thunderbird will swoop around the screen lobbing fireballs out of its head, with its head also being its weak point. Even though its head should be directly in range of the upwards thrust attack, only a standard slash attack will injure the boss after casting Thunder, which means you'll be jumping directly into the zone of danger where his fireballs are lobbing from. And to make matters harder, the more damage Thunderbird takes, the faster and more erratic his movements, while also lobbing fireballs at a faster pace. Jumping and attacking have been the common thread for most of the bosses throughout Zelda 2, so it makes sense to have a boss here where that would be the weakness. I also have a feeling that the reason players need to cast Thunder on him first is to prevent players from being able to cast the life spell, as you'll definitely want shield and jump to properly attack and have extra defense against the Thunderbird. Using Reflect also helps guard against fireballs if they would have hit the right spot, making for another incredibly useful spell that will drain your MP meter. I can see where this fight can feel unfair and like a war of attrition, as the Thunderbird will shoot so many projectiles. But I do think it's possible to be patient and run back and forth across the sides of the screen, timing your attacks to make this battle far more reasonable. While Thunderbird certainly isn't my favorite boss, I actually don't dislike this fight. I think it's a fitting challenge for the end of the game, and there is a way to avoid taking damage, even if it's tough to do. In an act of mercy, the game actually saves defeating Thunderbird even with the game over. Had that not been the case, I might have been far more anti-Thunderbird, as fighting Thunderbird, who's almost guaranteed to take away all of your magic, health, and potentially a life or two, and then straight onto the actual final boss would have been a difficulty level that would be a little too much for me. Speaking on that final boss, after defeating Thunderbird, players will enter the true final boss chamber, where they'll find the Triforce and, whoever this wizard or sage is supposed to be, and then fight off against Link's shadow, more commonly known as Dark Link. I don't think there's any official word on who this guy is, but I guess it's some special sage who's meant to both protect the Triforce of Courage and test whoever would come to claim it. So Link's test is fighting the hardest person in the entire game, the one who can destroy every guardian of every palace, Link. As the ultimate final battle, Link's shadow is the most advanced version of an Iron Knuckle, acting in the same way. He has Link's exact moveset and fights the same way, so it's a matter of very quickly reading his attacks and blocking while counterattacking with your sword. However, Link's shadow is so quick to block attacks. My first time fighting him, I didn't get a single hit on him and was wondering if the sword could even damage him. Thank goodness the Thunderbird stays dead for all of the attempts you just might need on Dark Link. So how does one defeat Dark Link? Well, it seems like every so often, Link's shadow will let his guard down when he's moving. So the way to exploit this is to crouch in the corner and attack him as he walks into you. Even if you miss, or he's close to you attacking constantly, he'll eventually leap away and then walk back into you, allowing players to get another strike in. I don't think that's how you're supposed to fight him, but it's the most popular strategy. Now, the other way that I found seemed to work on him is, if you recall, I mentioned the more advanced way to fight Iron Knuckles, although it's by far the faster and easier way when you know how, is to jump attack them in their visor. In fact, while the game has regularly promoted the idea of shield combat, most of the bosses have been about jump attacking, and as it turns out, jump attacking is the weakness for enemies like Iron Knuckles. So using that same strategy on Dark Link, you'll be able to find more openings. It's not as surefire as crouching in the corner, but if you leap from a distance, you're more likely to catch him off guard and land an attack. So, by combining this with occasional crouch attacks, I was able to fight and defeat him in what felt like a more normal and proper way, rather than this other cheese strat. I'm a little torn on how I feel about the Dark Link fight. I don't mind that there's a cheese strategy, and I don't mind that it's a difficult fight, but he attacks so fast for what I'd consider the normal way of fighting him with guarding up and down. It doesn't feel realistic to me that most, if any, players will be able to beat him this way, as he also automatically seems to guard just about everything. And look, maybe that's the point, but I don't think the game has taught you that you should be using this alternate strategy I used in the more normal version of the fight per se. Maybe, as I mentioned, you could say the boss fights should have been teaching you this, but I don't think they necessarily do. But using this jumping strategy actually was pretty fun, and this is the final battle, so it should be tough. For defeating Link's shadow, the Triforce Keeper will give Link the Triforce of Courage. Link will then return to the sleeping Princess Zelda, utilize all 3 Triforce pieces to awaken her, and it's implied they kiss behind a curtain. The end. Roll the credits! It's a short ending, but I do think it's more satisfying than the ending to Zelda 1, in part because there's a little more happening with Link obtaining the Triforce of Courage, and then us witnessing him use it to wake Princess Zelda. For finishing Zelda 2, players will be able to continue their save file in a sort of New Game Plus, where they lose all of their found items, but maintain their levels. It's not as huge as the second quest from Zelda 1, but it's still a nice additional touch if you want to see how well you can obliterate the beginning of the game by being so overleveled. Before wrapping up, I think it's fitting to bring up a fun quote from one of Zelda 2's directors, Tadashi Sugiyama. Nintendo asks, "I found the battles in the game to be extremely hard. Was this kind of difficulty level normal to the players of that time?" Tadashi Sugiyama responds, "It's difficult? The foundation of action games at the time was to feel difficult for everyone. Games didn't have a ton of content at that time, so in order to have them played for as long as possible, we felt like we couldn't make them easily clearable. We also did debugging, so we would play a game too much and the game would have a high difficulty that was interesting to us. One thing I remember is a call that we received from a customer at the time. He said he just couldn't beat the final boss. We talked with him and found out he was fully equipped, so we had to tell him he could only rely on his skill at that point. A pretty tough answer, right? The person seemed to be playing on behalf of a child. Sorry about that. So it's pretty funny to me that even Tadashi Sugiyama was aware of the game's difficulty and reputation it would receive. But the real reason I want to bring this quote up is that note on the team debugging the game and playing it so much that it led to them to create a game that was more fun for them, because they were becoming experts at Zelda 2 through the process, and therefore, to keep it interesting, they had to keep tweaking the difficulty harder and harder. I think that's a pretty easy trap to fall into when you're making a game. People who watch my videos probably know I've been working on my own game for the past few years, and I certainly feel that pull myself, with the thing that honestly reins me in being both my team member who I'm making the game with and doesn't test it as frequently as me as he's working on the art, while I'm working more heavily on programming and game mechanics, as well as whenever we show a friend or family member and I watch them struggling with things I don't even think about. I'm not trying to say my game will ever be as good as Zelda 2, but my point is simply that I can understand that trap. And you know what? I don't even think it's a necessarily bad thing. For players who want to improve and truly master a game, that's going to make for a more fun experience. It just means that the game will have a harder time appealing to a broader audience or first-time gamers. But for people who enjoy challenge and the game mechanics, this could make Zelda 2 their favorite game for exactly that reason. So that is Zelda 2, the oddball of the Zelda series. As I mentioned at the start of the video, while Zelda 2 is a major departure from Zelda 1, and like many, I do prefer Zelda 1, with the Zelda 1-inspired Link to the Past being one of my top 3 Zelda games in the entire franchise, I still enjoy Zelda 2, and I like the experimentation the team attempted with the game. It's easy for a team to see a successful game and say, let's make more of exactly that. And maybe that's the smarter thing to do. But that's what's so great about Zelda 2. The team tried something different, and we got to play something more unique because of it. For those of you who think I was overly critical of Zelda 2, especially near the end or second half of this video, that doesn't mean I dislike Zelda 2, and I hope I came across as fair in pointing out what I perceive to be various flaws in the game. Some of these videos where I tend to land a little more in the middle, when there's ardent haters and defenders, I feel like I run the risk of angering both sides. But that's a black and white way to look at things, right? I don't think Zelda 2 is a perfect game, but really, it's not bad. If you like the combat mechanics of Zelda 2, which I do, there's a lot to like about this game, even if it isn't the traditional Zelda experience many might have hoped for. And you know, some of the quirky design elements of Zelda 2 that we don't really see very often, at least that I'm aware of, like the way the random encounters work, or this swapping between an overworld exploration and 2D action mechanic, these are ideas that make Zelda 2 stand out in a fun and interesting way that make it worth a playthrough. So where do you land on how you feel about Zelda 2? And if you're old enough to have played it when it actually released, I'd love to know how you first felt about the massive change up to the gameplay. I was so young when I played both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 at a friend's house. As I didn't own these games, I honestly don't remember what my opinion was. I think my friend already owned both, so I didn't necessarily have some sort of expectation going into Zelda 2. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, this is now the second video of what I hope to be an ongoing Zelda design retrospective series. So if you haven't seen it, I did make a video on Zelda 1, and I'd like to continue forwards on one of my most beloved games, A Link to the Past. Also, I have more ongoing series like this. I just finished a video on Sonic 3, which brings me to 4 completed videos analyzing the classic Sonic games. And I've completed 10 videos so far analyzing the classic Mega Man series. As I mentioned, I've also been slowly working on a game with a good friend for a few years now, ChivalBee. It's an action platform game inspired by some of our favorite games of the past. While this is an old trailer I'm showing, we've been hard at work behind the scenes, and if the game looks at all interesting to you, we'd love if you followed us on our YouTube channel, Ophidian Interactive, for updates as we have them, and maybe eventually some devlogs. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace. Videos.